She called the devil for help, and he answered on the second ring. Grant had slammed her into the wall, resent his hand around her throat, and called it love. Celine ran to the stairwell with shaking hands, staring at the one number she swore she would never use. Luca De Vera was Chicago's most feared crime lord, but that night, he was the only man who could get her out alive. So she whispered, "I need help," and her old life ended. Picture a city built of cold glass and dirty secrets, where everyone turns a blind eye. Enter Celine. She is fading away on the inside, burying her pain beneath flawless makeup and empty corporate smiles. Her nightmare of a boyfriend has practically trained her to erase her own existence. But everything shifts when Luca Dero steps into the frame. Chicago has no mob boss more terrifying. He shatters her silence with one quiet question: who hurt you? Now she is trapped. A coward who breaks her in secret, or a mafia king whose protection demands her soul? Stick with me tonight. We are going to unpack a heavy story. The simplest life lesson is often the hardest to accept. Sometimes to finally escape a monster, you have to find the courage to shake hands with the devil himself. Let me know where you are listening from tonight. It is 6:47 in the morning, and the rain is coming down like broken glass. Celine stands frozen outside the massive apex tower, looking at those heavy doors like they might swallow her whole. Beneath her sharp blazer, her ribs are absolutely screaming. There is an ugly bruise spreading across her side that thick foundation just cannot fix. Her wrist is throbbing. Grant did that. He squeezed her arm last night hard enough to leave his fingerprints stamped deep into her skin. And what does she do? She swallows the same toxic lie she repeats every single day. She convinces herself it was not that bad. Here is the saddest life lesson of all. We often tell the biggest, most damaging lies to ourselves just to survive. She pretends that things could be worse, that he simply lost his temper. She pushes into a lobby covered in expensive marble and cold lighting that reeks of corporate greed. She takes the elevator to the 23rd floor, stepping into a grey room where endless spreadsheets quietly drain the spirit out of everyone. Celine sits to her desks by the window. She leans against the glass, watching strangers on the street, living painfully normal lives that never require hiding fresh bruises or memorizing desperate apologies just to unlock a front door. The simple life lesson is that everyday peace is a profound luxury some people only ever watch from afar. Her screen flashes to life, and a massive flood of emails instantly buries her under the weight of the morning. She skips the junk and clicks the high priority folder. The name waiting on her screen is Luca Devo. Just reading it feels heavy. Everyone in the building knows who he is. He is a Korean-Italian force of nature in his mid-30s, a man who learned early that real power means keeping quiet while your presence does the threatening. He owns half the luxury skyline in Chicago, operating deep in an underworld most pretend does not exist. Private security, dark logistics. Rumor has it he owns the city council. Celine had only seen him 3 times. The first time, he stalked across her floor, flanked by 2 men moving exactly like trained hitmen. The life lesson here is simple. True danger never has to raise its voice to make a room freeze in absolute terror. The second time, he was by the elevators, speaking softly on a phone. The quiet authority radiating from him was absolute. Then came yesterday. Luca was in the boardroom, and Celine was sent in to deliver files. Here is the tragic part. She was limping. Grant had violently thrown her against a kitchen counter. Her hip screamed with every step. She played her usual role, holding a blank mask and gripping the folders to stop her hands from trembling. But Luca saw right through the disguise. He did not look at her the way other men do. He watched her intensely, with dark, calculating eyes. He studied her the way a hawk analyzes a wounded animal. The life lesson is undeniable. You can never hide your silent pain from someone who already lives comfortably in the shadows. As the meeting ended, Luca held the door. His voice cut the air in a razor-sharp whisper, noting she was favoring her left side. Celine turned to ice. Panic flared. She spat out her practiced lie, insisting she was perfectly fine. She met his unreadable eyes, desperately claiming she was just clumsy and tripped. Luca did not blink. He dismantled her excuse with cold logic. He pointed out that people who trip fall forward, but she was actively guarding her ribs. The corridor plunged into a terrifying silence. Her throat closed up, and her heart hammered against her bruised chest. The life lesson is simple. You cannot hide behind a clumsy lie when facing a man who has mastered the brutal mechanics of violence. You and I know how this tragedy goes. She spent years perfecting her dark survival routine, deflecting blame, forcing smiles through pain, making excuses sound genuine. But under the cold gaze of a Mafia don, her lies felt entirely pathetic. Still, she doubled down, insisting she was fine. Luca gave a slow nod and stepped back. Before leaving, he said that whenever she was ready to stop lying, he would be waiting. Sitting at her desk, those words echo on an endless loop. It no longer felt like simple concern. It felt like a dangerous, inescapable promise from the devil himself. The morning drags on as her phone vibrates relentlessly. The life lesson is chilling. A painful secret is never truly yours alone once a powerful man decides to finally look closely. 4 messages were from Grant. Unhinged texts from a violently insecure man, making dark threats about tonight. She hits delete. Swiping his anger away is a tiny, desperate act of rebellion against a brick wall. At 10:30, her manager Linda marches over with a fake smile that always means disaster. Linda drops a heavy bomb. She orders Celine to conference room B by 11. The reason? Luca Diro personally requested her for a briefing. Celine feels the floor drop out. Out of hundreds of employees, the most dangerous man in Chicago specifically asked for her. The life lesson here is terrifying. You can try to stay invisible, but destiny has a brutal way of dragging you into the spotlight. Linda says not to overthink it, leaving before Celine can speak. The wait is suffocating torture, like bracing for a life sentence. Celine escapes to the bathroom, frantically fixing her makeup and smoothing her blazer with trembling hands. She stares into the mirror, ensuring the hollow corporate girl is all that remains. Every bruise is deeply buried. At exactly 11, she pushes open the door to conference room B. There he is. Luca Diro sits at the head of the dark table. He holds a heavy pen like a literal weapon. His charcoal suit is tailored so flawlessly, it looks like modern armor for a king of the underworld. The life lesson is undeniable. True power never needs to raise its voice. It simply crushes the air out of the room. 2 massive guards stand by the windows like stone statues, but Luca's piercing focus is locked entirely on Celine. He points to the chair beside him. The moment she sits, the room feels like a cage. Luca slides a folder across the table, bluntly admitting her proposal destroys anything his expensive team produced. Celine stammers a nervous "thank you." Luca cuts her off. His voice is cold as ice. He tells her he is not giving compliments, he is stating facts. Celine opens the folder, forcing her trembling hands to stay still. Luca points to a page, noting she caught a hidden error that would have cost him 6 figures. The life lesson here is absolute. When you sit at a table with wolves, your raw competence is the only armor that truly matters. Stick with me. Luca lists how she busted 3 corrupt vendor contracts that his finance team entirely missed. He locks eyes with her, stating she is either dangerously competent or everyone else is useless. A ghost of a smile twitches on his lips. Then he drops the truth. He is expanding to Milwaukee and needs a sharp operator. He leans in close. "I want you," he says quietly. Celine's mind short-circuits. She asks if this is a promotion. Luca shuts that down instantly. He is offering a new job, a new city, a massive salary, and dangerously dark expectations. He is literally handing her an escape route from her nightmare. The life lesson is profound. An escape hatch built by the devil will always demand an irreversible toll on your soul. She asks the obvious question, why me? Luca does not blink. He says she notices the hidden details everyone else ignores. He drops an emotional hammer, telling her she is better than this place. The words hit too close to her hidden bruises. Panic floods her chest. She stammers she needs a week to decide. Luca stands up. Before she can exhale, he delivers a brutal warning. He says whatever she is running from will not stop chasing her just because she stands still. Celine gasps, instinctively lying again, claiming she does not understand. Luca pauses at the door, looks back, and quietly replies, "Yes, you do." Then he is gone. Celine sits alone in that cold room for 5 full minutes before her hands finally start violently shaking. The life lesson here is profound. You can never survive your darkest nightmare simply by closing your eyes and freezing in place. She does not go home, not right away. Celine buries herself in the glow of her monitor, letting the spreadsheets blur together. Between noon and 8, her phone flashes 17 times. Most are from Grant, his text growing more unhinged by the hour. A few from coworkers, one from her mother. Celine stares at the glass, then deletes every single one. Total wipe. By the time she pushes through the lobby doors, the city is swallowed by the dark. Rain comes down in heavy sheets, turning the asphalt into black mirrors, reflecting the bleeding neon lights. Her apartment is a 40-minute train ride away. Every clattering second on those tracks drags her closer to the nightmare. Listen, sometimes the absolute hardest prison to escape is the one we willingly walk back into every night. You and I both know that heavy feeling, right? That dread when literally anywhere is better than going home. Celine despises the train. She hates the strangers pressing against her, the harsh lights washing the life out of everyone's faces. But it beats facing him. Grant hates when she is late, which is exactly why she stalls, dragging out every precious minute. She pulls herself up 3 flights of concrete stairs, her ribs still aching from the night before. Before her keys even scrape the lock, the door violently rips open. Grant stands there, jaw clenched tight. He is a genuinely handsome man with piercing green eyes that could disarm anyone. But hear me out, a beautiful face means absolutely nothing when the soul behind it is completely rotting away. Right now, those green eyes are dead and freezing cold. He snaps at her, demanding to know why she ignored his texts. Celine keeps her head down, trying to slide into a cramped apartment that reeks of stale beer. A basketball game blares on the television. She drops her bag, aiming straight for the bedroom, but his hand shoots out and snaps around her wrist. The grip is not breaking bone yet, but the silent promise of pain is clear. He orders her not to walk away. When she whispers that she is just tired, he loses it. He lets out a cruel laugh, spitting that she only pushes papers all day while he has real problems. It is the oldest trick in the dark. They shrink your exhaustion down to nothing, making you feel entirely crazy just for wanting a moment of peace, and he refuses to let go. The interrogation begins, and it is absolutely brutal. He leans in, demanding to know exactly who she was with. Celine tells the plain truth. She was just working late with her boss. But his jaw tightens. His thumb digs deliberately into the dark, ugly bruise on her wrist, a souvenir from his rage the night before. He calls her a liar. The walls of that tiny room feel like they are closing in, pressing the air out of her lungs. She begs him to let go. He stares her down for an agonizing second, then drops her arm in disgust. She retreats to the bedroom, shutting the door but leaving it completely unlocked. Locking it only invites the monster to break it down. She sits there, body aching, feeling held together by cheap tape. Always remember this: tiptoeing around someone's explosive anger will never, ever be love. Her phone vibrates against the mattress. She braces herself, expecting a cruel text from the man sitting just one room away. Instead, a message glows from an unknown number. The words make her breath catch. "If you need to leave, my security team can assist. No questions, no obligations, just safety." Signed with a single letter L. The weight of that offer is staggering. Celine stares at the bright screen until her vision blurs. Then she deletes it. She lies to herself, pretending she does not need saving. The next few days blur into a quiet routine of survival. By Wednesday, Grant pulls the sickening pivot. He brings home cheap flowers, kisses her bruised forehead, and blames his violent temper on work stress. And she just nods. Sometimes, we swallow the terrible lie of a fake peace just to survive the daily war. Fast forward to Thursday. Her powerful boss, Luca, summons her to the 32nd floor. The office is all glass and steel, with a sweeping view that reduces Chicago to a silent board game. Luca sits perfectly still behind a massive antique desk. Skipping the polite greetings, he tells her bluntly that he knows she is afraid to accept his help. Celine freezes by the heavy door, throwing up defensive walls, insisting she is not scared. Luca just leans back, his dark eyes reading her completely. He says everyone is afraid, but the real question is whether you fear the unknown more than you fear rotting in your own personal hell. Stick with me here, because that is a truth we all need to face. Celine chokes back her tears, her voice shaking as she whispers that he knows absolutely nothing about her life. But the reality is, Luca knows everything. He walks around his desk, keeping a deliberate, respectful distance. His deep voice is calm as he lays her secrets bare. He knows she is brilliant. He knows she comes to the office hiding fresh bruises. He knows she is suffocating in a nightmare. Celine balls her trembling hands into fists. She snaps that he has no right to pry into her pain. Luca does not blink. He calmly admits he has no right at all, but he is offering a lifeline anyway. A new position, a move to Milwaukee, a clean slate. He tells her she can stay and keep pretending, but she must stop lying to herself. Sometimes the cold truth hurts infinitely more than a physical blow, but it is the only real thing that will ever set you free. Luca makes it clear this is not a pity project. He is offering a real job, but the clock is ticking. The offer dies on Monday. Celine storms out without a word, but then Friday night arrives, and her fragile illusion entirely shatters. She walks in at 7:30. The air already reeks of cheap whiskey and bad intentions. Grant is completely wasted. Before the door even clicks shut, the screaming starts. He wildly accuses her of sleeping around. His voice hits her like a physical strike. He crosses the room in 3 violent strides, grabs her shoulders, and throws her hard against the drywall. A picture frame crashes down, glass exploding across the faded carpet. Let this sink in you. Can never love someone enough to magically cure the violent sickness of their own deep insecurities. In a fraction of a second, the nightmare turns lethal. But Grant's heavy hand slides up to her throat. He squeezes. It is not enough to crush her windpipe, but it proves one terrifying point. He holds her life in his grip. His sour breath washes over her face as he screams his paranoid delusions. Celine's vision starts to swim, the room bleeding into dark spots. Then, just as suddenly, he releases her. She collapses against the drywall, dragging raw air into her burning lungs. Grant stares at his hands, playing the victim, and the pathetic apologies immediately start spilling out. But Celine does not stay for the fake performance. She grabs her bag and bolts out the door. Understand this clearly. An apology served right after physical violence is never real regret. It is just a sick down payment on the very next attack. She makes it to the stairwell before her knees buckle. Celine collapses, shaking uncontrollably as she stares at her phone. Luca's unknown number is still there. Her trembling thumb hovers. Pride screams that she can handle this solo, that she should never owe a powerful man a favor, but survival overrules the fear. She presses dial. Luca answers on the second ring. Her voice shatters as she begs for rescue. Luca remains ice cold, steady as a rock. He orders her to stay hidden and hangs up. 15 minutes later, a black sedan glides to the curb. A massive guy in a dark suit steps out, scanning the shadows until he spots her. He nods calmly, stating he is Mr. Devo's man. Listen to me. Dropping your defenses and finally asking for help is the absolute highest form of human bravery. The driver speaks softly, assuring her of safety. Celine forces her trembling legs to stand. She climbs into the armored sedan, and for the first time in 3 years, she leaves that cursed apartment without a glance over her shoulder. The car slices through the rainy streets like a ghost. She rests her bruised head against the glass, watching the neon lights blur. The driver is a true professional. He never speaks, never pries, and keeps his eyes locked entirely on the road. The cramped city blocks fade away, replaced by a quiet enclave where the homes look like billionaire fortresses. We both know that taking a massive leap into the unknown is often the only way to truly save your own life. The heavy car glides down into a hidden underground garage. The driver opens her door with a respect she has not felt in years. He guides Celine to a secure elevator. The doors slide shut, and the cabin rises in absolute silence to the top floor. When the metal parts, she steps into a breathtaking penthouse. Massive glass walls frame the glowing Chicago skyline like a living painting. The space is anchored by dark hardwood and impossibly expensive furniture. It is a home built for a man who has nothing left to prove. Luca stands by the glass, hands buried deep in his pockets, watching the endless rain wash over the city. He turns to her, his dark eyes steady, and simply tells her she is safe here. Listen carefully sometimes. The absolute ultimate display of true power is simply providing a broken soul with a quiet, unbreakable sanctuary. You and I have seen people at their absolute breaking point, haven't we? Luca stood there, gesturing down the long shadowed hallway. He offered her a guest room, clean clothes, food, everything a shattered soul needs to just breathe. Celine was trembling, stammering that she couldn't take all this from a stranger. Luca didn't flinch, his eyes, heavy with his own dark past, locked onto hers. He told her no one should have to survive the way she had been surviving. When someone is drowning, you throw them a line, 0 strings attached. She choked on her sobs, the sheer weight of his mercy breaking her walls down. Listen to me tonight. True kindness never comes with an invoice. The good ones help just because they can. She drifted into that massive guest room and instantly turned the heavy lock, a pure, agonizing survival instinct forged by years of terror. Celine collapsed onto the mattress, and for the first time, the dam shattered. She wept, not from the fear of a heavy fist, but because someone finally saw her hidden agony and decided to catch her fall. When she woke up the next morning, the silence in the penthouse was absolute. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of waiting for a monster to break the door down. It was untouched, holy peace. She lay there in those crisp sheets, her battered nervous system slowly realizing the war was finally over. The hardest, greatest lesson we ever learn is that we actually deserve to be safe. Picture the cold perfection of that room. No cracks, no history to haunt her. But on the nightstand, her flashing like a warning siren. 43 missed calls, 67 texts from Grant. The pathetic, vicious cycle of emotional abuse playing out in real time. First the tearful apologies, then the blind rage, and finally the threats. She didn't even touch the screen. Celine dragged her body to the bathroom mirror, and the reality was brutal. Beneath yesterday's smeared makeup, the ghost of his violence remained. The purple shadows on her jaw, the literal fingerprints pressed into her throat. Right then, a quiet fire sparked in her chest. Sometimes, my friends, you have to stare dead into the ugly truth before you can finally wash it down the drain. Let's pull the tape back to yesterday. Celine had shown up completely hollowed out, shaking in the doorway. Luca took one agonizing look at the dark marks blooming on her neck, skipped the pointless questions, and made a single phone call. 20 minutes later, a calm woman named Dr. Brennan walked in with a medical bag and a camera. She was all quiet grace, promising Celine she was just there to document the pain, with zero pressure to call the cops. Celine just nodded, trapped in that terrible numb haze. The doctor worked like a shadow, photographing every single bruise Grant had left behind. It hurts to look back, but hear me on this. When someone leaves you broken, the smartest thing you can do is let someone witness the damage. That is exactly how you start fighting back. Before Dr. Brennan packed her bag, she delivered a quiet, heavy truth. She told Celine she was lucky no bones were shattered this time, but luck always bleeds dry. Standing in that bathroom, Celine felt the cold terror of those words deep in her marrow. You and I know that feeling, trying to pull on yesterday's clothes just to survive the morning. But the second she stepped into the living room, everything shifted. The rich, grounding scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Luca's dark world felt bright in the daylight. Newspapers on the counter, golden sun pouring through the massive windows, washing the city in pure hope. Here is a simple, beautiful truth to hold on to. No matter how brutal the night was, the sun is always going to rise and give you a fresh start. She walked slowly into the kitchen, and there was Luca, a man who commanded underground empires, just leaning against the island in rolled-up sleeves, reading the news. He slid a steaming mug of black coffee across the marble, and Celine wrapped her cold hands around it like a lifeline. When she asked she had been out, he casually mentioned it had been 14 solid hours of sleep. But then the air grew heavy. Luca met her eyes and calmly told her the phone had been ringing off the hook. He set his tablet down, asking the quietest, heaviest question. "Do you want me to handle it?" She whispered, "How?" And he simply replied, "However you need me to. Hold on to the people who step up to the plate when your spirit is too exhausted to swing. That right there is real loyalty." Luca stayed perfectly still, but a freezing, dark predator energy began rolling off his shoulders. Celine's breath hitched as she asked what handling it actually meant. He didn't blink. He told her he could make Grant stop calling, stop hurting her, stop existing in her world altogether. The terrifying weight of that promise hung in the air. He offered her two paths. One was legal paperwork and courtrooms. The other was his world, silent and utterly permanent. Celine's hands began to shake violently, begging him not to take a life. Luca just watched her, his voice a low hum. He said, "Then he won't be dead. I just want him gone." The takeaway is bitter but real. Setting a boundary is just a line in the sand, but enforcing it is what actually saves your peace of mind. Luca promised he would make the man completely vanish from her reality. Celine stared out at the sprawling city below, watching thousands of normal people living lives totally free of this suffocating terror. She whispered that she didn't know how to move forward. Luca didn't push her. Instead, he stepped up to the glass beside her and delivered a harsh, freezing truth. He said, "Men like Grant don't back down just because you ask politely or because a judge signs a piece of paper. They only stop when they have absolutely no other choice left. We have to be honest with ourselves here. You and I know you cannot negotiate with someone who feeds on your pain. Sometimes, the only survival tactic is to rip away their access to your soul and burn the bridge to the ground." Around 2 in the afternoon, Luca headed out with a heavy detail of quiet, dangerous men. He didn't hover over Celine. He just promised the penthouse was a fortress and left his private number on her screen. She spent hours trying to lose herself in a book, but her mind was pure static. Meanwhile, her phone was practically vibrating off the table with a relentless flood of messages. As the sky outside bruised into a dark purple, Grant's words turned toxic. He swung wildly from pathetic sobbing to cold rage. The classic trap baby please, I love you. And then the final chilling text. "I am coming to find you, please remember this." When an abuser loses their grip on your life, their frantic panic is never love. It is pure, desperate obsession meant to drag you back into the dark. That final message dropped into Celine's stomach like a lead weight. She sat frozen, staring at the glowing screen when her phone suddenly rang. It was Luca. There was no warm greeting. He cut straight to the nine. Grant was standing right outside the building. The cameras caught him pounding on the glass, slurring her name, completely unhinged and drunk on his own anger. Celine felt the air leave her lungs, but Luca's voice was a steady, freezing anchor. He laid out the play, option 1, his guards throw Grant to the police with assault charges. Option 2, Luca walks down there himself to make sure Grant understands exactly what comes next. When you are pushed to the very edge, having a fearless protector by your side is the only way to finally break the vicious chains of fear. Celine whispered, asking what kind of conversation he meant. Luca's response was a low rumble, the kind that leaves an impression. Even through the phone, the ruthless power of a man who controls the shadows was undeniable. She begged him not to shed blood. Luca promised he wouldn't lay a finger on him, but his tone was pure, unforgiving steel. He was a master at making stubborn men understand their place. Celine swallowed her terror and told him to do it. 2 agonizing hours dragged by before the elevator chimed. Luca stepped out, moving with total calm. He tossed his coat aside, poured a heavy measure of whiskey, and looked right into her soul. "It is done," he said. "True power never needs to scream. Sometimes the quietest moves echo the absolute loudest in the room." Stick with me here, because the way Luca broke that monster is something you and I need to truly appreciate. He took a slow sip of his whiskey and laid it out. He had walked right up to Grant, locked eyes, and informed him Celine was under his personal protection. One single text would be treated as an act of war against a man with endless resources and zero mercy. Then he mentioned Dr. Brennan's medical evidence, offering Grant a choice between a felony charge or disappearing forever. Celine quietly asked if he had threatened him. Luca's voice was dead calm. I simply stated the facts. Bullies only feed on your anxiety. When you stand tall and deliver the cold truth without a single flinch, the cowards who lived off your fear will always crumble into dust. The room's air is thick with the kind of tension you only feel at 3 in the morning. Luca isn't done. He looks Celine dead in the eyes and admits he laid out Grant's entire pathetic life for him. The job, the cheap bars, the mounting debts. He gave Grant one option: vanish or be forced to. Celine is unraveling, telling him he can't play God. Luca's expression is pure stone. I can and I did, he says, his voice a low rumble. He'd do it again without a thought. She tries to push him away, saying it isn't his fight. But Luca cuts through the static. You asked for help, and this is what it looks like. Here is a truth for the late-night listeners. Stop feeling guilty when someone finally defends you. Let them hold the line while your battered heart learns how to heal. Celine throws up her guard, pacing like a trapped animal. She refuses to owe him a favor, convinced this is just some dark chess game. She accuses him of doing this to gain leverage, to make her dependent on his power. That is the exact moment the ice around Luca shatters. The cold boss act drops. Because I actually care, he snaps, raw and unpolished. Celine freezes in pure shock. Luca steps close, his voice dropping to a heavy whisper. He saw her dragging herself to work every single day, smiling while that monster broke her spirit into pieces. You and I know how exhausting it is to wear that mask. Sometimes the heavy walls we build to keep the bad guys out are the exact same walls starving us of the love we desperately need. The emotional weight is suffocating. Luca confesses that seeing those dark bruises on her throat tore him apart inside. He threatened Grant, and he would gladly do it 100 times over. Not to own her, but because she deserves a life without fear. Celine tries to push him away, crying that he doesn't even know her. But Luca sees straight through her rusted armor. He tells her she is terrified. She thinks accepting protection makes her weak. She has been in survival mode for so long, she forgot how to breathe. The dam breaks. She cries, asking what happens next. Luca steps back, handing her the reins. Stay, run, fade away, it is her call. Let this sink in tonight. True power is never about holding the leash. It is about handing someone the keys to their own cage. The sun hasn't even crested the skyline when the nightmare returns. Grant ignores his restraining order entirely. Celine is dead asleep when Luca's phone vibrates in the dark at exactly 6 in the morning. He takes the call in the kitchen. 30 seconds is all it takes. He fires off 3 rapid orders, moving pieces on a board only he sees. By the time Celine wakes, the fire is already put out. She finds Luca drinking coffee, watching security footage on a tablet. There is Grant, screaming at the cameras at 5:47 a.m. Luca looks up, his dead flat.
The guy followed your car Friday night, he tells her. You and I need to remember this harsh reality.
When you disrespect a hard boundary, you are absolutely begging the universe to send you a storm. Panic spikes through Celine's chest. She asks where he is. Luca is unnervingly calm. He tells her the man is rotting in a holding cell until his Monday morning arraignment. After that, it's a roll of the dice. He might get bail, or Luca's lawyers might bury him. Then, Luca delivers the killing blow. It doesn't matter, because Grant knows where the safe house is. The sanctuary is breached. Celine feels the floor drop away, terrified, asking what to do. Luca doesn't miss a beat. She is leaving Chicago for the Milwaukee position. He has a secure apartment waiting, 2 hours north. Listen closely to this. Stepping away from a toxic battlefield isn't a surrender. It is a calculated strategy to win the war for your peace of mind. Luca gives her a choice that feels as heavy as an anvil. She can leave or stay in Chicago and handle Grant the hard way. Celine asks what that means. The temperature in the room drops. Luca's expression turns into a dark, bottomless void. A quiet violence radiates off him. He asks if she truly wants the details. She takes a breath, looks into that darkness, and whispers no. By noon, she is sealed inside an expensive black sedan, speeding north on Interstate 94. It all happened so fast. Luca's shadows swept through her penthouse like phantoms, packing her life away. They even cleared out the miserable apartment she once shared with Grant. Here is the bitter truth. Choose your battles wisely, because some doors once forced open can never be closed again. Before leaving, Celine signed away her old life. Stacks of legal documents, golden handcuffs disguised as a fresh start, massive relocation funds, silence clauses, and a huge salary. Now, in the back of this dark luxury car, the silence is deafening. Her driver is the same muscle from Friday, asking nothing, just driving. Celine watches the Chicago skyline vanish in the rearview mirror, taking her nightmares with it. Her phone vibrates. A text from an unknown number says her keys are with security. The apartment is in the 3rd ward. She stares at the glowing letters until her vision blurs, then powers the phone down. Let me tell you something about starting over. True growth is utterly terrifying, but staying in the dark is deadly. The new place in Milwaukee is breathtaking. An 8th-floor penthouse inside an old warehouse, windows looking over the dark river. Exposed brick, high ceilings, and perfect furniture. It is flawless and completely hollow. Celine stands in the dead center of the room, feeling nothing but the phantom grip of her past. She made the mistake of turning her phone on. It rings, her blood turns to ice. But it isn't Grant, it is Luca. His deep voice fills the empty space, asking if the sanctuary is acceptable. She whispers that it is way too much, but exactly enough. Luca tells her he will be there tomorrow to map out her new existence. She hesitates, trembling, and finally says thank you. You can build a fortress of gold, but peace of mind is always an inside job. Monday morning arrives with a heavy knock. Luca is not a man who deals in half measures. He is there at 9 sharp, the same security team from Chicago flanking him like gargoyles in the hall. Luca steps inside, carrying a leather briefcase and 2 coffees. He hands her one, black, no sugar. Celine asks how he knew her exact order. I pay attention, he murmurs. The coffee tastes like a rare sliver of comfort. Luca drops the briefcase on the marble island, pulling out massive stacks of folders. He walks her through vendor contracts, building security protocols, and logistics. Celine flips through the pages, her head spinning from the sheer weight of it all. Real rescue isn't just pulling someone from the wreckage. It is handing them the tools to forge their own armor. Celine looks at the paperwork, telling him it is too much. Luca shuts that doubt down instantly. Now, you and I are probably wondering the same thing she asks him next. Why? Why does a powerful man care so much? Luca walks to the massive windows, watching the dark river below. The silence stretches until it aches. When he was 16, he says, his voice hollow, he watched his father beat his mother half to death over a late dinner. He was just a kid, paralyzed by fear. 5 years later, the man finally killed her. Luca turns, his eyes locking onto Celine with a terrifying intensity. He swore he would never be powerless again. The strongest souls do not just bury their tragic past. They forge their darkest memories into a shield to protect the innocent. Luca snaps his briefcase shut. His words are heavy with sorrow. He looks at her and sees his mother, a woman just surviving, waiting for the bruises to get bad enough before walking out the door. He refuses to watch history bleed into the present. Celine's throat tightens. Is this just his guilt talking? What if Grant finds her here? Luca steps into her space, his presence overwhelming. He promises with eyes as cold as a grave that Grant will never draw breath near her again. The first week in Milwaukee is a chaotic blur. Celine uses work as an anesthetic, pulling brutal 12-hour shifts just to fall into a dreamless sleep. But here is the trap. Overworking yourself to outrun your demons only hits the pause button. It never actually deletes them. Sitting still is a death sentence for Celine's mind. The second she stops moving, the ghost of Grant's hands tighten around her throat all over again. Or worse, Luca's tragic confession replays in her head. Being truly seen means being vulnerable, and vulnerability is a luxury she cannot afford. So, she drowns herself in the hustle. Thursday afternoon arrives. She is sitting in her immaculate new office, burying her anxiety in shipping manifests. Then, the silence shatters. Her phone rings. A Chicago area code. Her lungs stop working. She stares at the screen before finally answering. A voice introduces himself as Detective Morris from the Chicago Police, calling about Grant. Celine's heart rate explodes against her ribs. You can buy a new life, but your past always keeps the receipt. You and I have seen this before, that terrifying moment when the past refuses to stay buried. Tuesday morning, the air in the precinct felt heavy. Grant, fresh out of a holding cell, filed a missing person report. He had the absolute nerve to claim Celine was taken against her will. The room started spinning around her. She stood there, hands trembling, explaining she left Chicago on her own, found a new job, a quiet place. But then came the gut punch. Grant was officially accusing her new employer of kidnapping. It is a bitter truth to swallow, but listen closely to this lesson. Manipulators will not just break your heart, they will gladly weaponize the very system meant to protect you, just to keep their fingers wrapped tightly around your life. Felt entirely suffocated as she agreed to meet the officer the next day, hanging up the phone in a hollow daze. She sat frozen at her desk before finally dialing Luca. He answered on the first ring, a steady anchor in her storm. She poured out the miserable story about Grant's fake report. For 3 long seconds, the line went dead silent. It was the kind of quiet where you can almost feel a man deciding how to tear the world apart for someone. His deep voice finally cut through the dark, promising his legal team would bury the detective in proof, exposing Grant for the abuser he truly was. He simply asked her to trust him. Here is a quiet truth to remember. Letting someone who truly respects your boundaries step up and fight your battles can completely alter the course of your life. By Friday, the investigation was wiped off the map. Detective Morris called, his tone entirely changed. He admitted Luca's team had provided overwhelming evidence, proving Grant's claims were nothing but vicious lies. His case closed, complete with a formal apology. Celine let out a shaking breath she felt like she had been holding for days. Morris added that Grant was ordered to cut all contact under threat of instant arrest. For a brief moment, Celine finally felt a fragile sense of safety, but that sweet relief lasted exactly 6 hours. Friday evening, she walked up to her apartment, only to find her front door cracked wide open in the shadows. Take this lesson to heart. A false sense of security is often the most dangerous trap a wounded soul can ever fall into. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She dialed Luca with trembling fingers. He answered immediately, ordering her to stay out. Security had flagged the breach, and he was already tearing through the city. Celine did not hesitate. She bolted down the emergency stairs, flying toward the lobby in a desperate rush for this exit. But then, the heavy echo of footsteps hit her ears. She spun around and the air left her lungs. Grant stood perfectly still in the doorway. He looked entirely broken, unshaven, with bloodshot eyes and ruined clothes. Yet, he flashed that exact same charming smile he used to wear on their best days. Always remember this hard truth. The most terrifying monsters in this world usually look exactly like someone we once gave our whole heart to. Celine backed away, shaking as she warned him about the legal order. Grant was lost in his own twisted delusion. He stepped closer, voice cracking, swearing his love, and promising to change. When Celine stood her ground, his eyes went dark, and he lunged straight for her. She screamed. Before his hands could reach her, the heavy lobby doors exploded open. You and I know exactly who was on the other side. Luca strode into the room like a dark storm. Grant froze completely. Luca commanded him to step back. When Grant foolishly tried to stand his ground, Luca grabbed his collar and slammed him into the wall with brutal, bone-rattling force. Take this lesson with you tonight. A true protector never just offers empty comfort. They step into the fire and become the physical wall between you and the danger. Picture the scene playing out before us. Grant tracked her across state lines, ignoring every boundary, but he never factored Luca into his plan. Luca's voice was pure ice. You are done. Grant tried to swing, but Luca dropped him to the floor with a single devastating punch. The heavy thud echoed through the lobby. Luca simply straightened his cuffs, turning to Celine as his violent energy dissolved into something tender. Are you hurt? She stood there in shock. This dangerous man delivered brutal violence to protect her, yet looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. When she asked why he let Grant live, Luca replied, "Because you asked me not to." Let this truth sink in. Someone who truly values you will honor your deepest boundaries, even when their vision is entirely painted in red. With Grant groaning on the floor, Celine found a piercing moment of clarity. She stood at the edge of a tall cliff. She could run, trying to hide where toxic men like Grant or dangerous figures like Luca could never find her. Or she could step into the dark unknown, embracing whatever life this man offered. As sirens wailed in the distance, she made her choice. She walked up to Luca. Take me somewhere safe. He searched her eyes, asking if she was certain. When she nodded, he guided her to the door. Grant screamed her name as officers dragged him away, but Celine kept her gaze pointed, straight forward. Here is a difficult but vital lesson. Sometimes, to save your own soul, you must sever the heavy, dead weight and refuse to ever look over your shoulder again. Celine watched the dark trees blur past from inside the car, her fingers tightly tangled with Luca S. Neither spoke. It was the heavy, ringing silence that settles after a disaster. Grant S. screaming was still trapped in her mind, mixed with the brutal crunch of Luca S. fist. She should have felt liberated, yet a freezing emptiness washed through her. She felt complicit, crossing a dark boundary without knowing the cost. Here is a painful truth about our deepest scars. Surviving trauma does not mean your pain magically vanishes just because the villain falls. The invisible wounds still leave a heavy mark. The vehicle finally slowed as massive iron gates swung wide open, revealing a breathtaking Gothic mansion hidden perfectly in the falling winter snow. Luca's men moved instantly as the engine cut out, scanning the dark woods for an ambush. Luca stepped into the freezing air, offering Celine his hand. The bitter wind struck her like a physical blow. She still wore her thin office clothes. Without a word, Luca removed his heavy coat and wrapped it securely around her trembling shoulders. They walked through massive doors into a cavernous foyer of dark stone and sweeping staircases. This was not a home. It was a fortress built to keep the outside world away. Suddenly, his phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. Take this gentle lesson with you. It is always the quiet, protective actions, rather than the loud promises, that reveal who truly has the strength to stand by your side in the dark. This is where the curtain gets pulled back. Luca barked into his phone, his voice flat. Status. Good. Keep him there. Make him understand. He hung up and turned to Selin, calmly explaining that Grant was rotting in a cell with a hearing on Monday. Luca casually stated his team would ensure Grant stayed locked up forever. Celine stared at him. How could anyone guarantee a legal decision? Luca dropped the heavy truth without blinking. Because I own the judge. Celine's stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. He casually strolled past her, pouring 2 glasses of expensive whiskey in his dark, leather-bound study. Listen closely to this harsh lesson. Discovering that the entire system is rigged is terrifying, but understanding how to navigate those broken rules will change your life forever. Luca offered her the drink, but Celine stood frozen. You own a judge, she whispered. Luca did not blink. I own several. She called it corruption. He called it basic survival. Taking a slow sip of his liquor, he delivered a truth that shatters illusions. The legal system was not designed to protect the innocent. It was built for manipulative men like Grant, who know how to smile and make the victim look unstable. Luca owned the judges because the game was already rigged. Celine argued that society is built on fair laws. Luca's voice turned to pure ice. And you think laws protected you? Take this bitter truth to heart today. Sometimes the exact rules we blindly rely on to keep us safe are the very things leaving us completely defenseless against the monsters in the dark. Luca tore her fragile argument to pieces. She had a legal order, yet Grant broke into her home anyway. The police did nothing until Luca forced their hand. He stepped closer, warning her not to lecture him about reality when she had been living in blind denial for 3 agonizing years. The words landed like a physical slap. Celine slammed her glass down before her trembling hands dropped it. She gasped that she needed air, but Luca insisted she needed to face the brutal facts. She snapped that she just needed to get away, bolting into the massive, echoing hallway. Outside the tall windows, snow was violently burying the dark forest. You and I both know this feeling. The hardest truth to finally accept is usually the exact one you have been desperately hiding from yourself. Let me paint the scene for you tonight. The room is thick with words they can never take back. Luca stands there, his jaw tight, admitting he pushed too hard. But he knows he had to break her denial. Celine just laughs, a hollow sound echoing off the walls. She throws his Mafia world of shattered jaws and dirty judges right in his face, calling him just another controlling man. Luca steps closer, his deep voice rumbling as he swears he is nothing like Grant, but Celine is furious, blinded by the dark empire he rules. He gently reminds her that she made that desperate call for help. His voice drops to a whisper, asking what her alternative actually was. You and I both know the agonizing silence that follows. Here is the bitter truth. Sometimes survival simply means choosing the lesser of 2 evils. Luca drives the harsh reality straight into her chest. He asks if she genuinely wishes she was back in that apartment, feeling Grant crush the breath from her lungs. He accuses her of choosing a quiet death over a messy life. The words strike Celine like physical blows. She gasps, whispering that his logic is completely unfair. They stay frozen in that hallway, the tension sharp enough to draw blood while the snow falls silently outside. Finally, the fight drains out of Luca. With a heavy sigh, he offers her the east wing. She can stay, or she can walk out into the cold tonight. The power is entirely in her hands. As the mob boss fades into the shadows, Celine sinks to the floor, weeping until she is entirely hollow. It is a painful but necessary lesson. You have to completely shatter before you can build yourself anew. The guest room is a sanctuary of overwhelming luxury. A blazing fireplace warms the heavy furniture, and a massive bed waits beneath thick silk sheets. Resting on an armchair is a pristine stack of clothing. Soft skirts, sweaters, and denim, entirely brand new and perfectly her size. Celine moves with hollow, mechanical steps. She washes the tear stains away, splashing freezing water on her face, until the haunted woman in the mirror looks familiar. Wandering downstairs, the silence of the sprawling mansion feels incredibly heavy. In a gleaming kitchen, she finds a fresh pot of hot coffee and a handwritten note from Luca. He tells her to rest, noting that security has the perimeter locked down tight. It is a stark reminder of a simple truth. All the vast wealth in the world means absolutely nothing when you are confined inside a beautiful, gilded cage. Celine cradles her warm mug, watching the heavy winter frost bury the sprawling estate. Her eyes fall upon her phone, abandoned on the counter. The screen glows with 23 missed calls and a mountain of voicemails. She presses play, and the sickening, slurred voice of Grant fills the quiet room. He is desperate, spinning the same toxic apologies she has heard 1,000 times. He frantically warns her about Luca, claiming the Mafia boss is manipulating her every move. Celine does not hesitate. She presses delete, erasing his pathetic pleas. The next message is a hungry journalist fishing for an expose on corrupt real estate. She erases that one just as quickly. Here is something we must all remember about survival. True peace requires entirely cutting the toxic noise out of your life, not simply turning the volume down. Then, the third recording begins to play. The third voice is cold and dripping with legal threats. It is Grant's attorney, spinning a wild narrative that Celine was forced into making false statements. He demands a meeting. Without blinking, she deletes the message. Setting the phone down, she realizes her hands are perfectly steady. The sheer terror has burned out, leaving behind a heavy, protective numbness. She wanders the grand estate like a lost spirit. She drifts through a towering mahogany library, past a gleaming indoor pool, and through quiet hallways. It feels incredibly hollow. This is not a home. It is a lonely museum, built by a man too consumed by his dark empire to actually live in it. It is a haunting reality we often ignore. Emotional numbness serves as a wonderful shield for a few lonely hours, but it will never eliminate the terrible demons patiently waiting for you in the dark. You and I have been watching this unfold, but we are about to hit a very dark turn. Luca steps out of the shadows with a thick envelope gripped in his fist. He tells her they need to talk. Celine lowers her book as Luca scatters harsh surveillance photos across the table. The first, which shows Grant aggressively stalking Luca's building. The next catches him lurking near her old apartment. But the third image is chilling. Grant is deeply engaged with a terrifying older man in a sharp suit. Luca watches Celine's confusion before dropping the anvil. That man is Vincent Castellano, a ruthless fixer for the most violent crime families in Chicago. The final photo reveals Grant scheming with known Mafia enforcers. Listen closely to this. Your past never actually stays buried, especially when it comes back to haunt you dressed in a tailored suit. Luca taps the photo of a brutal man. He identifies him Marco Santini an infamous loan shark alongside his violent enforcer, James Kwan. Celine feels the room spin. Why is her ex associating with actual monsters? Luca delivers the crushing blow. Grant is drowning in illegal gambling debt, owing over $200,000. He had been quietly siphoning money from their joint accounts for over a year. When Celine broke free and cut off his access, the payments stopped. Now, Santini wants blood, her chest tightening. Celine asks how Luca could possibly uncover this. He looks at her with eyes like black ice, stating that knowing every dark secret is how he stays alive. The lesson is brutal. Financial ties with a toxic partner will always drag you down into the deep. The nightmare deepens as Luca pushes a thick dossier across the polished wood. Celine opens it and her breath catches. Pages of notes detail her exact routine. Santini's enforcers have been hunting her. They have her work schedule, her address, and her exact net worth. To the mob, she is nothing but bait to force Grant's hand. Celine paces the room in sheer denial, demanding to know why Luca hid this terrifying reality. He answers with a harsh softness, explaining she was simply too fragile to handle the truth yesterday. Running from the darkness never saves you. It simply gives your problems time to grow sharper fangs. She stares out at the falling snow, trapped in a deadly Mafia war. Trembling, she asks what happens next. Luca does not hesitate. He vows to meet the loan shark himself, clear her name from their bloody ledger, and wipe the debt clean with his own money. Celine spins on her heel, her eyes narrowed with sharp suspicion. 200 grand is a massive fortune, and she demands to know his true price. She understands the brutal rule of survival. Nobody does a favor for free, especially a man who rules the criminal underworld. Luca steps into her space, closing the distance until the air between them burns. The dim light catches the jagged scar across his jaw. He stares into her terrified eyes and murmurs that his only condition is her absolute freedom. He wants her safe, never having to glance over her shoulder again. Stunned by the raw emotion radiating from him, she whispers, asking why he would go to war for her. Luca softly replies that she deserves to be protected. The unspoken bond between them crackles with heat. It is a powerful reminder. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who finally show you your true worth. Just as the fragile walls around her heart begin to crumble, her phone shatters the silence. The screen flashes an unknown number, and she makes the agonizing mistake of answering it. Let this be a clear warning. When darkness calls from a blocked number, never pick up. A chillingly calm voice fills her ear, softly explaining that he knows her exact location and the balance of her savings. Then he delivers the killing blow, whispering that Grant sends his regards. The loan sharks do not care about her ruined romance. They only want the money. Frantically, Celine tries to explain she left Grant months ago, but the voice cuts her off. The debt is $230,000. She has 7 days to deliver half, or they will start carving the payment out of her flesh. The line goes dead. Celine stands frozen, her blood turning to ice. The terrifying nightmare has breached her safe haven. Luca rips the phone from her trembling hand. He burns the number into his memory before barking orders to his tech team for a trace. He turns to Celine, his voice a whip, ordering her to pack her bags immediately. Tears spill as she reminds him of his promise that she was safe. Luca's jaw clenches as he brutally admits he was wrong. There is deep wisdom in that painful admission. When the ground crumbles, swallow your pride and adapt fast. Within the hour, they are tearing down the snowy highway in an armored vehicle. Surrounded by a heavy convoy, Luca grips the wheel, shouting rapid-fire Italian into his headset. Celine sits completely paralyzed, $230,000. All this chaos because of Grant. Trembling, she asks where they are running to in the dead of night. Now, you and I are about to see the depth of this man's obsession. Luca glances at her, his expression hard as stone. He reveals they are vanishing off the grid to a hidden safe house in northern Michigan. It is a fortress unknown to the outside world, and they will not return until he buries the threat hunting her. Celine stares at his shadowed profile. This violent crime lord has ripped her life apart, yet he guards her like she is the most precious soul alive. The pressure finally shatters her composure. She cries out over the engine, demanding he stop fighting her battles. True independence means carrying the weight of your own wreckage. But Luca white-knuckles the steering wheel and confesses his darkest secret. His voice breaks as he snarls that he genuinely cares about her. The words tear from his throat like broken glass. He despises that she is terrified. He is no longer just protecting a victim. He is going to full-blown war. Luca's voice cut through the heavy silence of the car, refusing the idea that he would just abandon her over a debt she never made. He told her, eyes fixed on the dark road, that caring does not switch off when the shadows get long. Celine tried to build her walls back up, asking what if she did not want his protection. Luca just gave her a ghost of a smirk. Too late for that, they drove deep into the black spine of the woods until they hit a forgotten cabin. Do not let the rough timber fool you. It was a fortress humming with generator power, satellite lines, and a roaring fire. His underworld reach was terrifyingly perfect. It is a simple truth: when someone stands between you and the absolute worst of the storm, you hold on to them. Inside the timber walls, Luca commanded her to rest. He stood by the window, a silent guardian, refusing to close his eyes until he knew the darkness could not touch her. Celine wanted to scream, mourning the quiet, ordinary life that was slipping through her fingers like sand. But alone in the bedroom, a deeper agony settled in her chest. She was falling for a monster. Luca was a manipulator who lived in the shadows, but he was the only one shielding her from the fire. That is the tragedy of it all. The heart is a reckless thing, pulling us toward the very danger we should run from. 3 heavy days bled away in that cabin. Celine watched him pace, his low baritone negotiating ruthless deals over a satellite phone with the absolute worst kinds of men. Celine sat by the dying fire pretending to read, but she heard every icy promise of violence Luca whispered into that phone. He was running a dark empire from the middle of nowhere. Then, as the grey light of day 4 crept in, the phone shattered the quiet. Luca listened, and the color drained straight out of his face. He delivered a heavy blow. Grant had escaped. The cowardly ex had bribed a transport guard and vanished 6 hours ago. Tonight, you and I need to remember something crucial. There is nothing more dangerous than a desperate man with absolutely nothing left to lose. Celine felt her lungs tighten, asking what they were supposed to do. Luca told her to stay buried here while he cleaned up the mess in the city. But Celine just shook her head. She was entirely done with hiding. She looked him dead in the eyes, her voice trembling but firm. She was finished letting him bleed for her battles. If this cold, brutal underworld was her reality now, she had to stand up and look it in the face. It is a harsh truth we all must learn. You can only hide in the shadows for so long before you have to step out and confront your own demons. Luca stared down at her, and for the first time, a flicker of raw respect crossed his tired face. He warned her, his voice a low rumble, that once she crossed this line, the old Celine was gone forever. She did not even blink. 20 minutes later, The tires were tearing up the dirt road, speeding toward the unforgiving skyline of Milwaukee. Luca stared at his buzzing phone. Grant was actively hunting her, tearing through her old life just to find them. Grant was tracking her scent like a rabid hound desperate for blood. By the time they reached Luca's towering glass high-rise, the building was a fortified cage. Armed men in dark suits stood like statues in the lobby, locking the world out. Luca hurried her up to his penthouse office, where the sprawling city looked like a tragic chessboard far below. He commanded her to stay planted in that room. Then he reached into his heavy desk and pulled out cold, black steel, a loaded handgun. He showed her the safety, his voice hollow, telling her to fire if the door opened, and it was not him. Listen closely. When the devil hands you a weapon to save your soul, you take it. Cécine just stood there, entirely paralyzed, her eyes locked on the heavy gun resting on the polished wood. She stammered out that she had never touched a weapon, but Luca cut her off. His dark eyes were devoid of mercy. If Grant broke through those doors, there would be no time for hesitation. Survival is an ugly, agonizing thing. It is about becoming exactly what you have to be when the fire burns everything else down. Then he walked out, leaving Céline completely alone in the echoing silence. She sank into the leather chair, staring at the tiny, ordinary cars below, weeping for the boring life she used to have. The quiet felt suffocating. Suddenly, her phone lit up, a text from Luca. Grant was in the building. Seconds later, another message. His men had him. Céline barely had time to breathe before the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed in the hallway, right outside her door. The heavy oak door swung open, and the shadow of the dawn filled the frame. Behind Luca, two massive guards dragged Grant into the room. Céline felt her stomach turn. The man who broke her heart looked hollow and pathetic, his clothes completely ruined. Yet, against all odds, Grant twisted his mouth into that familiar, toxic smile. He looked right at her and whispered, "Hi, baby. Let me tell you something. Do not ever let a ghost from your past smile at you while they stand on the ashes of your life." Luca dismissed his men with a single flick of his wrist. The door clicked shut. The heavy silence was suffocating. Grant started whining, playing the broken victim. Luca's voice was a dead calm as he told him his time was up. Grant just began to laugh, asking Céline if this mobster was a holy savior. And this is where the earth completely shifts beneath Céline's feet. Grant locked his desperate eyes on her and started tearing away the veil. He spat out the truth. Luca was not just a businessman playing rough. He owned the bones of this city, the judges, the police, the entire dark machine. Céline tried to hold her ground, swearing she had survived Grant's madness before, but Grant was not finished twisting the knife. He pointed a trembling finger at Luca and dropped the killing blow. Luca was never her protector. He was her puppet master. Those immaculate contracts, the secure job, she had been laundering dirty syndicate blood money for weeks. Here is the tragic lesson. When a miracle falls into your lap and looks entirely too flawless, you are usually the one paying the invisible price. Those words struck her chest like a physical blow. The edges of the massive room began to blur and darken. Céline turned her pleading eyes to Luca, begging him with every fractured piece of her soul to call Grant a liar. But Luca just stood there. He did not say a single word. And you and I both know that silence is the most agonizing confession a man can give. Grant was choking on his own sick laughter, relishing her pain. He spelled it out, detailing every signature, every bank transfer she thought was legitimate. She was nothing but a mule carrying the sins of a Mafia boss. The air vanished from Céline's lungs. She held her hand up, her voice trembling as she commanded Luca not to take another step, not to even look at her. The sheer weight of that betrayal was tearing her heart completely in two. Something deep inside her simply shattered. Celine lunged for the heavy desk, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel of the handgun. She raised the barrel at the man she thought was her savior. Time stopped. Luca raised his hand slowly, his deep voice slipping into a smooth tone, begging her to drop the weapon, but her sorrow had turned to pure rage. She had surrendered her life to him, and he had turned her into a criminal. Here is the painful truth: the people who promise to save you are often the ones building your cage. The gun shook in her grip. Finally, the tragic truth spilled from his lips. He needed someone invisible, a soul so clean the law would never look twice. She was just a mark. Those words broke her entirely. She was just a disposable money on his board. But then the armor around Luca's soul began to crack. His mask crumbled, and he confessed that amidst all his sins, she was the only piece of truth he had left. You see, no matter how carefully you control the game, genuine emotion will always be your downfall. Celine just stared at him with empty eyes, whispering that he was a liar. Before he could answer, Grant was pathetic actioning. He lunged, his hands wrapping viciously around Celine's wrist. He twisted her arm with a sickening force. A deafening blast echoed through the high-rise. Celine looked down, her breath catching as deep crimson rapidly stained the pale carpet. Luca dropped slowly to his knees. The ex had just shot the king. Celine was trapped in a waking nightmare. Every beautiful lie she had believed was now violently bleeding out onto the floor. The dark crimson spread relentlessly, soaking into the fine rug. Grant stood entirely paralyzed, staring at the smoking barrel in his hand, as if the weapon had just materialized from thin air. He had no idea what he had unleashed. A few feet away, Luca was losing his color rapidly. He pressed his heavy hand against the wound, but the blood slipped mercilessly through his fingers. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing in a room full of chaos is the one man who refuses to panic. The mobster did not scream. He stayed on his knees, his dark eyes locked onto Grant, ordering him to drop the weapon with chilling composure. Grant's fragile mind was entirely fracturing. He stumbled backward, stammering pathetically that it was an accident, trying to convince the bleeding Don that Celine would have pulled the trigger anyway. It was a coward's desperate logic. Luca was bathed in cold sweat, his breathing ragged. He gave Grant one final warning: if he bled out on this carpet, his men would tear down those doors and erase Grant from existence. Celine remained anchored to the floor, drowning in the horrific spectacle. Then the ex crossed the ultimate line. Grant pointed the trembling steel straight at Celine. He wept, screaming that their life was perfect before the Mafia stepped in. Denial is a dangerous drug. Through her tears, Celine hit him with the hardest truth. We were never, ever happy. You and I know that keeping secrets only builds a house of cards. The tension in that room finally shatters. Celine unleashes years of buried agony, her voice cracking as she exposes every lie and every bruise Grant inflicted on her. Grant's knuckles turn white around his gun, spitting venom about giving her a flawless life. But the heaviest blow comes from the floor. Luca quietly validates Grant's twisted claim, admitting he used Celine because her clean record made her a perfect shield. The confession shatters her completely. Still, Luca insists she deserves the absolute truth, even if it hurts. We have all learned the hard way that the truth rarely brings comfort most of the time. It just leaves a permanent aching scar. Luca is fading fast, his life pooling onto the hardwood, but he refuses to let the silence win. He forces the words out, confessing that watching Celine wither away in Grant's cold grip was a tragedy he could not ignore. The laundering scheme was a calculated excuse to pull her into his protective shadow. Before that heavy confession can settle, Grant loses whatever is left of his mind and yanks the trigger. A deafening crack echoes as plaster rains down, the bullet missing Luca by mere inches. Grant is howling in total madness. Then the heavy doors violently burst open. Luca's tactical guards flood the room, weapons raised and screaming commands. Let this be a simple reminder. When you push a desperate man into a corner with nothing to lose, he will always show you the monster underneath. Luca attempts to drag his broken body upward, but his legs betray him entirely. Gripping the edge of his mahogany desk, he stares Grant down with the frozen eyes of a predator. He offers a simple ultimatum: drop the weapon, or die breathing his own blood. But Grant chooses a much darker path. With a violent jerk, he yanks Celine backward, jamming the cold steel of the barrel directly against her temple. Panic floods her veins, drowning out everything but Grant's suffocating scent of pure desperation. Celine looks past her captor and meets Luca's eyes. The untouchable, calculating kingpin is entirely gone. In his place is a terrified man watching his whole world slip away. Sometimes, deep love is the exact thing that strips us of our armor and leaves us completely powerless. The air grows incredibly thick, heavy with the scent of blood and impending grief. Luca orders Grant to let her walk, but Grant is far beyond reason, pressing the muzzle harder into her fragile skin. He barks out a delusional fantasy, demanding the guards retreat, an escape vehicle, and a fortune wired to his name. Luca dissects the demand with ruthless logic, promising him calmly that he will be dead before the elevator doors open. Grant howls, swearing he will drag them all to the grave. In a move that defies all reason, Luca quietly commands his men to lower their weapons. Grant erupts into maniacal laughter, believing he holds all the cards. It is a vital life lesson for us all. Arrogance makes a man entirely blind to the trap closing right beneath his own feet. Stick with me here, because survival is a terrifying thing. Celine keeps her eyes locked on Luca during the agonizing standoff. Then a microscopic shift happens. Luca's dark eyes dart her right arm for just a fraction of a second. She understands instantly. Twisting her body, Celine drives a brutal elbow straight into Grant's ribs. The breath escapes him in a ragged gasp. His weapon wavers, and Celine dives for the floor. 3 deafening blasts rip through the heavy air. Curled tight, she waits for a burning sting, but only silence follows. She lifts her head to find Grant motionless and ruined. Against the desk, Luca is bleeding heavily, watching his enemy fade away with empty eyes. The lesson is clear sometimes. The truest protection comes without making a single sound. His voice barely a whisper, Luca commands his men to summon the trauma team. Celine drags herself across the floor to hover over Grant. The man who cast such a dark shadow over her life is fading, gasping out a final, pathetic claim that he truly loved her. But the dark spell is broken. She stares down at him and delivers the cold truth: he never loved her. He only loved the cruel power he held over her spirit. You and I have probably seen this tragic illusion before. Never confuse a captor's obsession with a lover's devotion. Grant searches her empty eyes and softly asks if this is the end. She gives him a simple, unforgiving yes. As his chest stops moving, a profound revelation washes over her. The heavy chains are finally gone, and she feels absolutely nothing at all. In the eerie quiet, the Mafia boss finally surrenders to gravity. Luca slides down the wallpaper, coming to rest in a dark, expanding pool of his own making. Celine scrambles to his side, her numbness entirely replaced by pure, blinding panic. She presses her trembling hands fiercely against the jagged wound, feeling the terrible warmth of his fading life. With tears blurring her vision, she strictly orders him not to leave her alone. Even through the agonizing pain, a faint, genuine smile touches his lips. He whispers that he supposes he will have to stick around. Minutes later, the private trauma team bursts through the doors like a hurricane. They push her aside, packing the wound with clinical precision, shouting that the lead is still lodged on inside. They prepare to move him. The lesson here is brutal time waits for absolutely no one when death is finally knocking. The chaotic scene is a blur of desperate shouts. As the medics strap his fading body to the stretcher, this hardened crime lord does the unthinkable. He forces his bloody hand outward, reaching for Celine. With his final ounce of strength, he whispers that she is finally free to run from this cursed life. But Celine grips his hand tightly, promising she is not going anywhere. Listen closely to this midnight truth when the illusions shatter and the world burns down around you. The foolish souls by your side are the only ones worth bleeding for. They rush him away to a secretive underground clinic meant only for the elite and the dangerous, where questions are never asked. Hours drag by like lifetimes in that waiting room, leaving her completely alone to just stare at the dried, tragic crimson caked beneath her own fingernails. Sitting under the harsh fluorescent glare, Celine looks like a walking ghost story. A fractured, hysterical laugh bubbles up in her throat as the absurdity of her reality sets in. Who could she even call? Her toxic abuser is dead, and the criminal mastermind she is deeply drawn to is fighting for his life on the surgical table. The isolation is suffocating. Then, a quiet nurse approaches, breaking the endless dread. Celine's heart stops. The bullet miraculously missed his major organs, and Luca is stable. The invisible weight crushing her chest suddenly lifts, leaving her breathless. Let me tell you something vital tonight. Sometimes the most agonizing trial we ever face is simply sitting still in the hollow aftermath, trusting the silence, and waiting for the painful dust to finally settle. We drift into the dim quiet of the recovery room. Luca looks tragically pale against the white sheets, tethered to a chorus of rhythmic monitors. Every mechanical beep is a stubborn declaration that the king still breathes. Celine pulls a rigid chair to his side, taking his heavy hand while her mind replays their entire twisted romance. She traces back to the moment this dangerous man noticed her broken spirit and offered her a glittering shield. She remembers the lavish penthouse and the comforting security. But the painful truth is that every tender memory was also a calculated move on his dark chessboard. Here is a harsh reality for the lonely hearts out there. You can never build a genuine, lasting shelter on a foundation of beautiful lies, no matter how desperately you want the fantasy to be real. Celine is finally facing the music. In the heavy stillness, the terrifying epiphany finally strikes Celine. She does not just feel gratitude toward this shattered mobster. Against every ounce of logic, she is deeply, irreversibly in love with the man who used her as a pawn. But before that realization can bloom, the door swings open. Enter Margaret, Luca's ruthless attorney, wearing an expression made of pure ice. Without missing a beat, the lawyer unloads a devastating reality check. She clinically lists the dead ex, the dirty money, and the paper trail pointing right at Celine. The federal government could bury her under a mountain of racketeering charges. The lesson here is unforgiving. Always understand the true cost of a savior's protection before you sign away your soul. Celine's legs entirely buckle beneath her as the crushing weight of her shiny new prison closes in around her. Panic floods her system entirely. Celine desperately stammers that she was completely blind to the crimes, but Margaret shuts her down. Ignorance does not keep you out of a federal cell. But then, the attorney reveals a secret that takes all the oxygen from the room. Margaret promises she can make every piece of evidence completely evaporate. Why? Because as they were wheeling Luca into surgery, his final command was to shield Celine at absolutely any cost. The hardened boss is fully prepared to burn his entire underworld kingdom to ash just to keep her free. This is the raw essence of love, my friends. True devotion is never found in expensive gifts. It is the terrifying willingness to lose absolutely everything you have to keep someone else safe. Utterly speechless, Celine asks what she must do, only to be told to step back and let the professionals work. Before vanishing into the night, Margaret drops one last heavy stone on Celine's conscience. The authorities have processed Grant's S body, but the Syndicate S invisible hands have worked overtime. The bloody shootout has been officially scrubbed, categorized neatly as a tragic, isolated suicide. A wave of nausea washes over Celine. The lie is monstrous, entirely erasing the violent reality she survived. Margaret only offers a cynical smirk, welcoming Celine to a dark life where the truth is just clay waiting to be molded. It is a bitter but necessary life lesson. The narrative is never written by the righteous. It is entirely scripted by whoever holds the most power. As the lawyer slips away, Celine is left to drown in the dark reality of her complicity. 3 hours later, a low groan echoes from the bed. Luca is awake, and their true reckoning is finally here. You and I know what it is like when the dark finally catches up. Luca lies flat, eyes on the ceiling, jaw rigid as the bullet wound burns his side. Celine whispers his name, and he shifts his gaze. Stunned, she has not run away. She simply says she keeps her promises. He forces out a breath, asking if Grant is dead. At her nod, his response is a cold good. She questions the fake suicide story, but he offers the brutal math of the streets. The truth means a cage, and he prefers the lie. Celine stares at the city lights, feeling her innocence slip away. Here is a truth for the midnight hours. The line between victim and villain is often just survival, but we still must own the choices we make. She turns to him, eyes burning. You used me. You lied to me. The tension in that sterile hospital room is thick enough to choke on. Celine stands over his bed, knuckles white, letting the anger spill out. She tells him he twisted her into someone she hardly recognizes. Luca does not blink, firing back that he would rather have her breathing and tainted than pure and buried. But then her armor cracks. Her voice shakes as she admits she should leave him to rot, yet she cannot walk away. Beneath all the blood and the toxic games, he was the only soul who saw her when the world looked right through her. Then comes the confession she fell in love with him. Luca, the untouchable boss, is left entirely speechless. It is a heavy reminder for us all. Sometimes the very people who drag you into the deepest shadows are the only ones who truly recognize your worth. Luca is not the kind of man to absorb a hit without returning fire. He matches her confession, his deep voice thick with emotion. Watching her survive and rebuild completely broke his defenses. He tells her he would orchestrate every dirty lie all over again if it kept her alive, rather than resting 6 feet under. Pushing his luck, he tries to sit up, but the agonizing fire in his gut forces him back down. Catching his breath, he praises her raw strength, admiring how she refuses to tolerate anyone's garbage, least of all his. He knows he is a dangerous criminal she should run from. But listen closely. True love is never about being perfectly flawless. It is about owning the ugliest parts of yourself and fiercely protecting the one person who makes you want to be better. Here is a king of the underworld, stripped of his power, quietly begging her to stay, not out of obligation, but because she chooses to. Celine stares at the man who shattered her reality and somehow kept her breathing through the fallout. Every instinct tells her to run from Chicago, to escape a world where bullets do the talking. Instead, she leans forward, pressing her lips to his, mindful of his bandages. Pulling back, Luca manages a weak smirk, asking if that seals the deal. Celine meets his gaze with ice, whispering a quiet maybe, reminding him she is still burning with fury. It teaches a quiet truth. Sometimes you have to set your blinding anger on the shelf for just 1 minute to hear what your heart is asking for, even when the situation is an undeniable, chaotic mess. Celine does not let romance erase the sins. She makes it clear the money laundering nightmare is not forgiven. Her terms are ironclad, one single lie, and she is gone like a ghost. Luca looks her in the eye and swears she will get only the unfiltered truth. She wants to trust him, praying this is not another calculated performance, but keeps her walls high. 4 days later, the Stubbs boss forces his way out of the hospital against medical orders. His crew stashes him in a pristine penthouse, mostly because his old office is still painted in his blood. Celine begs him to rest, but he is already back to running the streets. It is a harsh reality we all face. Building real, unbreakable trust demands serious time and consistent actions, not just pretty promises whispered in the dark. Frustration boils over as Celine snaps, reminding him that staying alive should be his only job. Luca waves a hand, treating a nearly fatal bullet wound like a paper cut. She hits him with a cold stare, forcing the stubborn man to sink onto the couch. She turns to pour water, but when she looks back, he is already glued to his phone, commanding his empire while wincing. She orders him to drop the phone. There is an edge in her voice so sharp that the crime lord actually freezes. He sets it aside, asking what is wrong. Unblinking, she demands to know their next move. He tries to deflect, suggesting they just rest, but she refuses to let him hide. Here is a vital lesson for anyone listening. You can never step into your future if you keep running from the heavy, uncomfortable conversations. She holds her ground, telling him that merely surviving is no longer enough. She needs to know exactly what this tangled mess between them actually is. Luca falls silent before turning the question back on her. What does she want it to be? When she confesses she is utterly lost, his voice softens. He suggests they just breathe. 1 single day at a time, no expectations, just the two of them. Celine studies the dangerous man who promised her sanctuary but dragged her into a storm. She slowly nods, but draws a line in the concrete. One more lie, one more shadow game, and she walks away forever. It brings us to a truth we must never forget. Drawing hard boundaries is not selfish. It is the absolute only way to guard your peace when you are navigating a toxic and unpredictable world. Fighting through searing agony, Luca leans closer to make a sacred vow. He swears his remaining days will be spent answering for his sins. He promises radical honesty, offering back the freedom he stole, vowing never to overlook her value again. His dark eyes offer no escape, only conviction. Celine feels the knot in her chest loosen and accepts his word. 2 weeks pass. As Luca heals, Celine steps out of the shadows, taking the wheel of his legitimate business fronts. She learns that running an underworld empire mirrors a massive corporation, just with deadlier consequences and heavier artillery. This brings a beautiful revelation to light. Sometimes being shoved entirely out of your comfort zone, is the only way to uncover the fierce, hidden power you never knew you held within yourself. We all need a shield when the storm hits, and for Celine, that is Margaret Chen. This attorney practically lives at the penthouse, dropping thick contracts on the table, quietly reminding Celine she is still dancing with major felonies. Margaret is pure ice. She promises that as long as Celine stays under Luca's protection, she is untouchable. Untouchable is a mythical word in Chicago. When federal agents come knocking, Margaret blocks the door, unleashing a terrifying blend of legal brilliance and subtle threats. Celine decides not to question. Grant's demise remains filed as a tragedy, and the press moves on. There is a deeply practical lesson woven into the chaos here. No matter how tough you think you are, having brilliant people defend your blind spots is the only way you survive. You and I know that peace is just the deep breath before the plunge. For a minute, their world felt almost normal. Then, at 3 a.m, a scream shatters the dark. Celine wakes to find Luca on the bed, shoulders tight. He murmurs into the receiver, asks for a body count, and hangs up. Santini's men just burned one of his warehouses to ash. 3 lives gone over a refused debt, because here, bruised egos are paid in fire. Luca forces his shirt on, teeth grinding as his fresh wounds stretch. He declares he must fix this. Celine is on her feet instantly, demanding to go. He shuts her down, ordering her to stay in the safety of the penthouse. But here is the lesson they keep ignoring. You can never build a true safe haven while choosing to live inside a burning house. That is the moment the old Celine dies. She looks him dead in the eye, declaring he no longer dictates her fate. Luca pushes back, voice rough with panic, swearing if she bled in this turf war, he would never forgive himself. He storms out. Celine is left in the quiet room, heart hammering, choking on a mix of terror and rage. Instead of hiding, she reaches for the heavy steel Luca gifted her weeks ago. She checks the safety, feels the cold weight in her palm, and walks out. She drives to the decaying warehouse district. Broken glass, rusting fences, desolate roads. She parks blocks away, walking as the sky bleeds thick black smoke. It reveals a chilling truth about loyalty. Sometimes you simply have to run straight into the roaring flames to prove that you belong to the fire. A wall of black smoke swallows the dawn. Sirens scream, but Luca's soldiers form a barricade, keeping the authorities at bay. Celine finds him near the heat, the orange glow of his ruined empire reflecting in his dark eyes. She walks right to his side. He does not turn, just growls that he ordered her to stay safe. She shoots back that she is done being handled like fragile glass. He warns her of the danger, the real chance of dying. She meets his pointing out his own mortality. Finally, he turns, demanding to know why she followed him into hell. She delivers the absolute truth. This is her reality now. He dragged her into the shadows, and she will not play pretend. Here is the final lesson for tonight. You cannot truly claim to love someone while refusing to stand shoulder to shoulder with them on their darkest battlefield. You and I need to pause here, because this is where the earth shifts. Luca stands in the heavy silence, asking if she truly grasps the weight of crossing this line. There is no coming back. Celine does not blink. She tells him her old life bled out the second she made that call from the dark stairwell. Luca reads the scars on her soul and finally nods. She is in, but under his rules. Turning to the roaring flames, he lays out the nightmare he has planned for Santini, the man who practically raised him, the father figure he now has to destroy. They will strip away his money, his respect, and his empire, brick by agonizing brick, until nothing is left. Here is a quiet truth for you sometimes. The fires we use to burn our enemies are the very same ones that end up scorching our own souls. If the old man chooses the grave, Luca murmurs, they will gladly dig it for him. Right on cue, the burning warehouse behind them groans and collapses in a shattering roar, sending a storm of embers into the black sky. Standing in the heat, Celine feels the final bridge burn. She is no longer just a victim trying to survive the night. She has hardened into something sharp, something deadly. As the pale morning sun begins to bleed over the city skyline, a small, genuine smile breaks across her face. The panic is gone, replaced by a cold appetite for the chaos ahead. It reminds us of a bitter reality. Fear only holds its grip on your throat until you finally reach up and claim your own power. And just like that, the war begins. Not with gunfire, but with frozen accounts and dead phone lines, a silent strangulation. The old empire did not fall in a day. It bled out, slow and suffocating, just as Hitler promised he would do to the man who once called him a son. Celine sits quietly in the shadows of smoke-filled back rooms, absorbing the heavy, broken street code spoken by men with ruined faces. She spends her nights tracing dirty cash through blood-stained ledgers, putting her name on papers that bind her to the underworld forever. She stopped trying to wash her hands long ago. We all have to sleep in the beds we make, no matter how cold the sheets are. 3 weeks fade into the dark. Then Luca finally corners Santini's beating heart, a massive supply hub on the south side. On paper, it is just moving ordinary furniture. In reality, it is a river of heavy, illegal painkillers hiding in plain sight. Luca stands over the blueprints, like a ghost staring at his own grave, sliding pieces across the map. He is a tactical genius, using every trick the old man taught him. They are hitting the place at 4 in the morning, right when the guards change and the world is asleep. Get in, blind the cameras, drain the vault, and vanish before the sirens even spin up. Celine watches his cold eyes and asks the hard question. Why poke the bear? Why practically beg Santini to hit back? Luca does not look up when he answers. A desperate man, he says softly, always makes the fatal mistake. That is the only way to end him for good. You see, the hardest lessons always come with a price. Pushing someone to the edge is how you find out who they really are. Celine knows she should feel sick about this cold-blooded trap. But the truth is, she feels absolutely nothing, only a terrible, freezing calm settling into her bones. She looks him dead in the eye and asks when they are leaving. Luca pauses, his heavy gaze questioning her sudden claim that they are a true team. Celine does not flinch. She tells him she is past the point of pushing papers, and she knows exactly what she owes the dark. He stares at her, searching for hesitation, but finds none. He finally nods, but he makes it clear she stays in the shadows, no heroics. By 3:30 in the morning, the city is a graveyard. 4 dark cars glide through the mist with 12 heavily armed men. Celine rides shotgun, the heavy tactical vest pressing against her chest like an iron cage. Then, out of the fog, the target appears. A brutal concrete fortress, sleeping in the pitch black. The place is wrapped in cold steel. Thick chain-link fences, sweeping cameras, and glaring floodlights that turn the dead of night into artificial noon. But Luca brought his best ghost. The tech guy silently cuts the video feeds from a glowing laptop, leaving the brutal lights burning so the guards suspect nothing. In the shadows, the crew slices a clean tear through the hidden east fence. They bleed into the compound like dark water. Inside, the sheer scale of the operation is dizzying. Mountains of shipping crates swallow the sky. The heavy air bites at their throats, thick with the stench of diesel, wet cardboard, and a harsh chemical tang. Luca signals with his hand. the squad shatters into pieces. A few men melt away to secure the exits, while the rest drift silently toward the main records room. Stick with me here, because this is where the tension pulls tight enough to snap. Celine moves like Luca's shadow, drifting into the belly of the warehouse. They find the old man's true fortune tucked away inside a massive steel cage. Lucas Enforcer steps up with hydraulic cutters. Metal snaps like bone, completely silent under the hum of the generators. The doors swing open to reveal a kingdom of poison. One of the guys pries open a crate, exposing endless rows of tiny bottles. Millions of dollars in heavy painkillers. The dark currency of ruined lives. Luca stares at the wealth that paid for his childhood, taking a cold photo for the buyer. He makes one whispered call to summon the transport trucks, and then they simply wait in the suffocating dark, listening to their own jagged breathing. The silence finally breaks when 3 heavy trucks roll backward into the loading bay, headlights slicing through the gloom. Luca's men operate like a perfectly oiled machine, throwing crates into the dark with a practiced rhythm. Celine holds her position by the massive steel doors, her fingers wrapped tight around her weapon. The blood is rushing in her ears, her heart threatening to crack her ribs. This is the jagged edge of the underworld. Then, a scrape of boots. A security guard steps out of the blackness, trembling violently. He holds a radio in one hand and a drawn pistol in the other. Celine levels her barrel at his chest, her voice cutting through the damp air, telling him to freeze. The man nearly drops his gun, pleading in a broken whisper that he is just a worker trying to survive the shift. The guard is practically weeping, confessing that his bosses will bury him if he lets the cargo vanish. Celine's eyes stay cold. She warns him that if he raises that radio, her crew will put him in the ground tonight. Behind her, the heavy doors slam shut on the last loaded truck. Time is up. Then, the man chokes back a sob and whispers about his 2 little kids waiting at home. That confession strikes Celine right in the ribs. Here is something you must remember. True power is not found in the lives you take, but in the ones you spare. She lowers her piece just a fraction. She tells him to think of his family, drop the steel, and vanish. Walking away alive is the only victory tonight. He drops his gear and bolts into the fog. Luca drifts out from the shadows, spots the abandoned radio, and offers a quiet nod. Luca could have ended the man right there, but he let her mercy stand. With one sharp gesture, the crew loaded up, engines screaming as they tore through the gates and melted into the dark. By the time the sirens wailed, the cops found nothing but tire tracks, and a babbling guard. But you and I both know the tragic truth of this life. If you corner a king, you better be ready for his wrath. 2 days later, the old man answered. A massive car bomb ripped the face off Lucas' restaurant in the dead of night. No one died, but the fiery message echoed through the streets. Yet Luca did not flinch. He pushed back against the man who raised him with ruthless grief, burning another warehouse to ash and buying off Santini's most loyal men. The father and son were now locked in a deadly, heartbreaking dance. The streets were officially burning. Celine was running on empty, her nerves completely frayed. Every time a floorboard settled, her hand twitched. Every time the phone lit up, she expected news of a fresh grave. She slept with her weapon tucked directly under her pillow. It is a grim reality we must all face. Living your life on borrowed time will eventually hollow out your soul. The final thread snapped on a quiet Tuesday morning. Luca answered a burner phone, and the color vanished from his face. The old man who taught him everything had just found their sanctuary. Celine's reality completely shattered. Someone had finally sold them out to the devil. Luca didn't waste a single breath demanding answers. He barked at her to pack only the essentials. 10 frantic minutes later, they tore out of the driveway. Luca gripped the wheel with white knuckles, driving like a man possessed, dodging traffic as if death itself was riding his bumper. He promised they were heading to a silent cabin up north, but the hollow doubt in his voice betrayed him. Here is the coldest truth of the underworld. There is absolutely no safe house on earth when the father figure who built you decides he wants you dead. They barely clear the city limits when a blacked-out sedan slides into their rearview mirror, matching every frantic lane change. Luca spots the ghosts in the glass, his jaw locking tight. He warns Celine to hold on and crushes the accelerator. The engine screams, hitting 100 miles an hour on the empty highway. But then, a second dark car glides right up to their passenger side, and the tinted glass begins to slowly lower into the door. The cold steel of a gun barrel breaches the morning air. Luca roars for Celine to get down just as the first round shatters their back window, raining jagged glass over their trembling shoulders. A second bullet tears through the door, missing Celine by a mere breath. Luca yanks the wheel, throwing the car into a desperate 70-mile-per-hour exit, tires screaming in raw agony. They blast into a quiet neighborhood where innocent folks are just brewing their coffee. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson for you. Real trouble never politely knocks, and it certainly does not care if it ruins your morning. The heavy sedan behind them is closing the gap, spitting lead that turns their mirrors to dust. Out of options and running on pure survival instinct, Luca does the unthinkable. He violently stomps the brakes. The car violently whips sideways, screaming across the cold asphalt. The pursuing sedan has absolutely no time to correct course. They slam into Luca with a sickening crunch of twisted metal. Celine feels the brutal impact rattle deep into her bones. The airbag explodes outward, charging the cabin with thick chemical smoke. Listen closely, because here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. Sometimes you have to cause a massive, ugly wreck just to keep yourself out of an early grave. Before the ringing in her head can fade, Luca is already pulling her from the wreckage. They run with the desperate panic of the hunted. Behind them, dazed but furious mobsters crawl from the ruins, weapons drawn. Luca drags Celine down a rotting alleyway, vaulting a wooden fence as hot lead snaps the air right past their ears. Luca steps into oncoming traffic, leveling his weapon at a passing truck. He roars at the driver to vanish, and the terrified man bolts. Luca throws Celine into the cab, peeling out just as the streets erupt into a war zone of wailing sirens. They burn rubber for 20 agonizing minutes before ditching the stolen ride in an overgrown lot. The engine dies. The sudden silence is absolute. You and I know the truth about adrenaline. It is a beautiful liar, and when it fades, the body pays a heavy toll. Celine shivers uncontrollably, blood tracking down her pale face. Luca calls his people, demanding an immediate extraction. He looks at Celine, quietly asking if she is all right. She gives him a flat, hollow no. He checks her trembling hands. Just surface cuts. They will heal. Luca softly tells her she did great out there. Celine snaps back that she was almost killed. But he offers only a cold, hard truth: she is still breathing. There is a simple, meaningful life lesson in his harshness. Comfort is utterly useless when pure survival is the only thing left on the table. They sit in that dark truck, covered in dried blood, mourning yet another burned identity. Then, a sickening realization washes over Celine. The true tragedy is that she is actually getting used to this terrifying madness. Soon, the backup squad arrives. New cars, fresh muscle, but The exact same deadly atmosphere. They are dragged to a windowless underground bunker. Luca's peoples are scrambling like ants, rebuilding a ruined hive. And standing right in the center of the chaos is Margaret. Margaret completely skips the warm greetings and drops a heavy reality check. Santini is already painting Luca as a rogue thief to the city. He has dirty politicians barking and federal agents digging into their shadows. Luca asks if she can keep a lid on the fallout. Margaret just shakes her head. Santini is so blinded by revenge that he would burn his own kingdom just to watch Luca swing. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson for you. A man with absolutely nothing left to lose is the most terrifying monster on this earth. Luca does not even blink. He quietly declares that they are ending this war tonight. Margaret is stunned, calling his plan outright murder, but Luca is done running. Margaret looks at Celine, asking if she is really okay with blood on her hands. Celine coldly replies she just wants to live. Margaret exhales an exhausted breath, promising to erase the legal paper trail so they stay out of a concrete cell. But her warning is absolute. If this goes wrong, there are no second chances. They will be hunted animals until the end of their days. Keep this simple, meaningful life lesson close to your heart when you decide to burn your bridges. You had better know how to swim. Luca coldly promises that failure is not an option. He just tells her to enjoy the show. Santini runs his violent empire from a luxury restaurant. Crisp white tablecloth by day, ruthless blood money by midnight. Luca knows Santini is gathering his top enforcers there tonight. It is the perfect chance to finally sever the head of the snake. Or, if the street intel is poisoned, it is the most lethal trap ever constructed. Luca assembles a lethal squad of 8 ghosts, men ready to catch a bullet. Celine demands to ride with them, but Luca instantly shuts her down. She fires right back, telling him his desperate protector routine is finished. He argues she has no training, but Celine delivers a chilling truth. Her training began the exact second he shoved a weapon into her hands. Remember this simple, meaningful life lesson. You can never awaken a starving tiger and expect it to behave like a gentle house cat. Luca glares at her, his jaw tight, but looking into her fierce eyes, he knows he is lost. He caves, strictly ordering her to remain in the getaway vehicle. They roll out into the dark at 10 o'clock sharp. 4 silent cars glide up to a cozy brick restaurant, its warm glow hiding the brutal slaughter that is about to unfold. The restaurant seems incredibly peaceful, but is a masterfully crafted illusion. Luca's men creep through the heavy midnight shadows. You and I are sitting right there beside her in that freezing getaway car. Celine grips her binoculars, watching the crew violently breach the front doors. Suddenly, frantic muzzle flashes light up the frosted windows, and then the world shatters. The second floor detonates in a roaring fireball. Flames tear through the roof, sending a violent shockwave that rocks her vehicle. The simple, meaningful life lesson here is brutal. Just when you think you hold the winning cards, life flips the table. Celine's ears ring with pure agony. She whispers a desperate denial, throwing her door open and sprinting blindly into the suffocating black smoke where Luca just disappeared. Pedestrians shriek as burning debris rains from the night sky. Celine ignores the heat, charging through the shattered entrance. Inside is a living nightmare. Flames chew through the walls, illuminating a floor covered in ruin. She finds one of Luca's men bleeding by the bar and begs for his location. He weakly points toward the kitchen. Remember this simple, meaningful life lesson. True loyalty will make a person walk willingly into a raging inferno. Celine pushes deeper into the toxic black smoke. the intense heat searing her skin. She trips over broken concrete and dark shapes she refuses to identify. Then she sees him. Luca is buried under heavy wreckage, his face painted in blood, perfectly still. She drops to her knees, screaming his name until his eyes flutter open. He weakly whispers, his legs will not move. She frantically looks down. A massive beam is crushing Luca's leg, a dark pool of blood rapidly expanding across the floor. Celine grabs the scorched metal and violently heaves, but it is like lifting a freight train. The raging fire is literally licking at their heels. Luca weakly begs her to abandon him before the ceiling caves in. Write this simple, meaningful life lesson down. Sometimes sheer stubbornness is the only thing standing between life and a cold grave. She absolutely refuses to leave, screaming from the depths of her soul as she yanks the beam again. Suddenly, blistered hands join hers. Two surviving enforcers, half dead and burned, throw their fading strength into the lift. The heavy beam finally shifts. Luca roars in pure agony as his mangled leg comes free. Celine instantly orders the men to get him vertical. They drag Luca upright. The blinding pain makes him scream as he nearly loses consciousness. Celine wedges herself under his shoulder while an enforcer takes the other side. They stagger toward the exit as the dying building groans. They burst through the doorway onto the pavement. Seconds later, the structure violently pancakes into ash. Celine slumps on the curb, cradling Luca. Take this simple, meaningful life lesson to heart. The most devastating traps are the ones we proudly walk into. Sirens wail from every corner. The enforcer panics, warning they need to vanish. Celine cuts him off, demanding if Santini is dead. The man shakes his head in defeat. Santini was never there. It was a flawless trap. Exhausted, Celine's vision slowly fades to a heavy black. You and I can guess things went completely sideways after that. Celine tells a fading Luca they must vanish before the law arrives. Fast forward through absolute chaos, and they are hauling his wounded body into a getaway car. They peel away from the blazing scene, leaving a mountain of heavy consequences behind. Celine is crammed in the back, Luca's head resting in her lap as warm blood soaks her clothes. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. When a war demands your blood, it stops being business and becomes deeply personal. Amazingly, Luca refuses to die. He endures brutal surgery and cold metal pins in his broken leg. He will carry a permanent limp, but his heart still beats. They pack up their shattered lives and ghost to a nameless hideout. No street address, just raw map coordinates. Picture the scene with me, late-night listeners. Luca is bedridden, fighting through the sheer agony of his wounds, while a power vacuum threatens his empire. Stepping into that heavy silence is Celine. There is no official coronation. She simply stands before hardened men who deal in death, freezing them with a stare colder than winter. They think she is just a scared girl, but she shatters their pride by matching their own dark ruthlessness. 2 weeks after the restaurant fire, her network locates Santini. The rival boss is rotting in an isolated compound, choked by extreme paranoia, clinging to his last few guards. Celine carries this fatal secret directly to Luca. In this broken world, true power is never handed to you. It is simply taken by those willing to bear its heavy weight. The bedroom air is suffocating. Luca sits against the headboard, his shattered leg elevated, his eyes burning with a desperate need for revenge. When Celine reveals that Santini is completely abandoned, Luca tries to force his broken body upright, biting back sheer agony to declare the war ends tomorrow. But Celine stands her ground, refusing to let him throw his life away. Luca stubbornly argues he will ride in the car just to watch his enemy bleed. Then Celine sits quietly on the mattress and shatters his entire reality. She asks for his top enforcers so she can execute Santini herself. Luca stares at her, terrified, insisting she does not have the cold darkness required to pull the trigger. We often blind ourselves to the terrifying evolution of the people we care about the most. You and I must witness the heavy tragedy of this moment. Lupat begs her to walk away, reminding her he was born into this dark underworld while she was dragged into the nightmare. But Celine does not waver. She looks into his exhausted eyes and states she is making the ultimate choice right now. She is choosing to protect their fragile empire, and she is choosing him. That raw devotion shatters his resistance. With a clenched jaw, Luca surrenders his two most lethal enforcers, begging her to return alive. Hours later, the cold dawn washes over Santini's rural farmhouse. Celine steps from a dark vehicle in heavy armor, gripping a weapon that feels frighteningly natural in her hands. Love is a heavy anchor, and sometimes it pulls you directly into the darkest abyss. The former king is reduced to 4 exhausted guards shivering in the damp cold. It is a deeply agonizing fall from grace. From miles away, Luca's technicians blind the security grid, drowning the property in total silence. Celine and her strike team breach the perimeter, moving through the grass like phantoms. The outside guards are subdued in seconds, dragged into shadows without a single sound. The front door splinters open, and the squad floods the interior. The house is a mausoleum of broken pride. Expensive furniture is buried under filthy dishes, reeking of cheap smoke and consuming terror. The lower floor is completely hollow. Celine grips her weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs, and begins the dark march up the stairs. True ruin always begins in the mind long before it breaks the body. The bedroom door splinters inward, revealing the architect of so much misery. Santini is slumped by the window, watching the sun bleed over the horizon. The pistol in his lap looks like a heavy anchor. He stares at Celine with hollow eyes, rasping that she took her time. When she orders him to drop the weapon, he lets out a dry, broken laugh. He spent his life building a dark empire, only to watch her tear it down over her dead lover's unpaid gambling debt. He sneers, calling the dead man simple collateral, spitting that the weak always pay the toll. Then, with a trembling grip, the old boss raises his barrel to fire. In that split second, the terrified girl vanishes forever. Celine pulls her trigger 3 times, shattering the dawn. When you strip away everything a person loves, you leave them with absolutely nothing left to fear. The old king hits the floor with a heavy thud. His weapon clatters away, and he lays there, chest heaving as life drains from his lungs. Choking on his final breaths, he whispers he never believed she had the darkness inside her. Celine stands over his fading body, her face carved from pure ice, and softly admits she did not think so either. Santini offers one last gruesome smile, welcoming her to the underworld. Before his eyes go dark, the room falls into a deafening silence. Celine stares at her hands, realizing the innocent woman she used to be is forever gone. The ultimate boundary is crossed. A heavy hand grabs her shoulder as Marco urges her to move. The strike team vanishes like smoke, leaving professional cleaners to scrub the farmhouse spotless. Life often forces us to adapt, even if it means becoming the very monster we once desperately ran from. We need to sit with this reality for a moment. The woman who once flinched at shadows has just cemented herself as an underworld queen. The police find a sterile crime scene and a dead kingpin, just another ghost story in a tired city. Inside the dark getaway car, the adrenaline drains away, leaving Celine utterly hollow. She stares out the glass, processing the chilling truth that she has become the nightmare she used to hide from. At the safe house, Luca waits on the porch, his injured leg elevated, his expression unreadable. Celine climbs the wooden steps, collapses beside him in the damp air, and softly whispers that the deed is done. A crushing silence stretches between them until Luca gently asks what she feels. She stares into the dark trees, her voice trembling, and confesses that she feels absolutely nothing. Emptiness is often the heaviest burden a human soul can carry. The cold air settles around them as Luca lays his soul bare. Looking at her trembling hands, he offers her an ultimate escape. He promises to forge a flawless new identity, complete with endless funds and a quiet life far away. She could vanish into peace, but it means she would never see him again. If she chooses to stay, she steps fully into the dark. No more hiding behind his protection. She would reign as an equal partner in a bloody empire. Celine bitterly whispers that he is trapping her, but Luca gently shakes his head. A cage is only a cage when the door is locked, he tells her. She gazes out at the endless trees, her heart fractured, crying that her old innocent self is dead. Luca touches her arm, reminding her that what remains is a fierce survivor who absolutely refused to stay broken. True strength is always born in the ashes of our former selves. Tears spill down Celine's face. She argues her hands are permanently stained, bound to a dark underworld she can never wash away. Luca does not deny the violence, but his deep voice cuts through her panic. He reminds her that despite the blood, she is finally breathing, independent and unbreakable. Her voice cracks as she confesses a terrifying truth. She stared a dying man in the eyes, ended his life, and felt zero remorse. Luca offers a sad, knowing smile. He whispers that her fear of that numbness proves her soul is still intact. The real tragedy is when the coldness feels comfortable. They sit together as the sun breaks the horizon, the ordinary world waking up while her entire existence shifts. Finally, the heavy tension snaps. With a steady, hardened gaze, Celine tells him she is not running away. Sometimes a terrifying jump into the dark is the only way to truly live. Stay with me on this, because her reasoning shatters the soul. She looks at the man who saved her and explains she spent 3 agonizing years cowering in shadows, paralyzed by the fear of being a victim. The last 6 months taught her how to bare her teeth, fight back, and command respect. She refuses to shrink back into an invisible ghost, even if it means wearing a crown of thorns in a dark empire. Luca reaches across the space, his heavy hand wrapping tightly around hers. His voice drops into a fierce vow, swearing he will spend his remaining breath ensuring she never regrets this path. She smiles sadly, whispering that tomorrow is impossible to promise. He simply replies that he will fight for it anyway. Bathed in the pale dawn, 2 deeply damaged souls decide to forge a kingdom from their shared trauma. The strongest bonds are always forged in the brutal fires of survival, never in comfort. 6 months later, the transformation is breathtaking. The cold winds of the city whip around Celine as she stands tall, watching concrete rise into a massive new community sanctuary. This building will house battered families, offer job training, and create a fortress for those running from violent homes. The haunting irony? It is entirely funded by the freshly laundered wealth of Luca's underworld syndicate. They are taking the currency of blood and transforming it into genuine salvation. While the public views it as a brilliant shield, Celine's heart is poured into every single brick. She personally designed the escape networks, mapping out the exact lifelines she desperately prayed for during her own years of terror. True healing begins the moment you take your deepest, most agonizing pain and weaponize it to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The steady tap of a polished cane signals Luca's approach. He steps beside her, his healing leg finally bearing weight, a testament to his brutal recovery. He gazes at the rising steel and softly calls her a miracle worker. Celine offers a modest smile, claiming she is simply putting their dark resources to practical use. The city noise fades as Luca leans on his cane, his deep voice carrying a sudden gravity. He gently asks if her mind ever drifts back to that blood-soaked dawn in Santini's bedroom. Without looking away, Celine admits the ghost of that morning haunts her daily, not as a crushing regret, but as a permanent reminder of the chilling cost of power. Luca looks at her with absolute devotion. He is immensely proud that she survived the fire and that she gathered the broken ashes to build an empire of hope beside him. Real love is building a beautiful future directly on top of your darkest ruins. We have reached the final chapter of this dark tale. Celine rests her head against his heavy coat and quietly asks where else she could possibly belong. Luca reminds her she holds the keys to her own cage, but true freedom is an illusion they abandoned long ago. Her mind flashes back to the freezing apartment where she used to cover her bruises and pray to remain invisible. That shattered girl is nothing but a distant ghost, buried beneath layers of thick armor and ambition. When the sun sets, they retreat to a sprawling penthouse high above the glittering skyline. It is not a paranoid bunker. It is a breathing, beautiful home. Celine has filled the space with vibrant life and warm light, transforming a killer's empty fortress into a sacred haven. Sometimes you have to walk straight through absolute hell to finally find the one place where you truly belong. Picture this scene with me. A quiet evening that looks so beautifully ordinary. Celine moves softly through the kitchen while Luca sits at the marble island, reviewing contracts like any tired executive. But underneath that fragile illusion lies a cold reality. There is a loaded weapon hidden right there in the drawer, and shadows of armed men pacing the hallways outside. Later, as the glittering city lights stretch out below their balcony, Luca hands her a heavy, sealed envelope. You and I might expect a diamond ring, wouldn't we? Instead, he gives her the deed to the Wisconsin estate, the exact place where she first learned he was a syndicate boss. She stands completely frozen, the paper trembling in her hands, entirely unable to comprehend why he would just hand her the keys to his dark world. The weight of his gaze pins her down as he confesses the estate has been legally hers for 3 months. No strings attached. Celine stares at the document as if it were a loaded weapon, her voice barely a whisper when she finally asks him why. Luca's response is laced with the grim reality of a man marked for death. He needs her to have a sanctuary, completely severed from his rotting underworld, just in case he doesn't make it back one night. She clings to a desperate hope, swearing he won't fall, but Luca knows the brutal truth of his life. Hope is a beautiful dream, but preparation is what actually keeps you breathing. The truth is, we all need an exit strategy when the walls close in. Defeated, she asks the heaviest question of all. Does he regret this brutal life? With a heavy sigh, the Don admits the collateral damage haunts his every waking moment. But beneath that heavy remorse, Luca's voice drops into a velvet murmur. He tells her he will never regret surviving, and he could never regret the dark twist of fate that brought her into his life. Celine tries to pull away, whispering that she is nothing but broken pieces. Luca refuses to let her hide. He reaches out, his lethal hand surprisingly gentle, and calls her a masterpiece in progress. It is a desperately cheesy line, Yet Celine lets out a broken laugh because it is exactly what she needs. She leans into him, her lips meeting his in a tender kiss, silently thanking this dangerous kingpin for giving her a real choice. And as these two wounded souls find a fleeting moment of peace on that balcony, the oblivious city sleeps below, completely unaware of the brutal shadows raging in the sky above them. This is the exact moment everything rebuilds inside Celine's soul. Stick with me here, because this is where the quiet girl finally fades. She realizes playing by society's fragile rules nearly cost her her life. Now she breathes deeply in the morally grey shadows, commanding the dark instead of running. 1 year later, we find them at the grand opening of a community center. Flashbulbs pop, politicians smile, and the press buys the illusion of corporate saints. But you and I know the blood-stained money paving these floors. Standing beside her lethal protector, Celine watches exhausted, terrified women walk through those doors. They carry the exact same haunted eyes she once had before she learned that embracing your inner shadows is sometimes the only way to step into the light. Watching those fragile women, the absolute weight of her purpose settles into Celine's bones. When the cameras pack up and the hollow applause fades, she and Luca walk the silent halls together. The air feels heavy. She looks at him and asks if this place will actually save anyone. Luca doesn't even blink. He tells her it cannot fail because she built every single brick using her own agony as the master blueprint. Pausing under a skylight bathed in cold moonlight, Celine confesses her deepest awe. She never thought the toxic violence that nearly drowned them could be forged into a weapon for healing. Luca stares into her soul, his deep baritone cutting the quiet. "That is what survivors do," he murmurs. "They transform." But when she softly asks if that is all she is to him, he pulls her in, promising she is so much more than just a survivor. He tells her she took her tragic narrative by the throat, completely ripping up the script to write her own ending instead of letting trauma bury her. He calls her extraordinary, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely shows the world. In the center of this empire, built on dark money, they share a slow, cinematic kiss. For the first time since this nightmare began, Celine's racing heart finds actual peace. 2 years drift by since the shadows claimed their worst enemies. And where do we find our Mafia queen, sitting on a therapist's couch? For months, she dodged this room, convinced that carrying her pain alone was the ultimate proof of her strength. She tried to fight the ghosts in her head all by herself. It was Luca who gently broke through her stubborn walls, reminding us all that true courage lies in letting someone help you carry the weight. The Don had looked her dead in the eyes and dropped a heavy truth. Refusing help isn't bravery, it is just another place to hide. He taught her that the ugly, grueling process of healing is just as hardcore as surviving a bullet. So Celine puts in the agonizing work, learning exactly how deeply fear rewired her brain. When the doctor gently pivots the conversation to Luca, Celine offers a tired, honest smile. Things are complicated, yet undeniably good. Does she trust the deadliest man in the city? Yes, but not with the blind naivety of the girl she used to be. The real shift meant when Luca finally stopped shielding her from the blood stains and started treating her like an equal. The greatest victory of her entire life wasn't winning a mob boss's heart. It was realizing she never needed a knight in shining armor to step up and save her. She saved herself. The therapist smiles, labeling this realization as significant growth, but Celine leans back, her eyes heavy with memories, and admits it just feels like survival. And honestly, in their ruthless underworld, those two words mean exactly the same thing. Leaving the clinic, she finds a window seat in a local cafe, watching the oblivious citizens rush through their painfully ordinary days. She opens her phone, swiping through the evidence of her new reality. The towering foundation. A rare, genuine smile on Luca S.'s face, the snowy silence of their Wisconsin fortress. This dangerous life is hers. Suddenly, the screen lights up. It is the Don himself, confidently threatening to cook dinner tonight. She texts back, teasing his tragic culinary skills, but surrenders on one condition. She picks the wine. It is a perfect, quiet domestic rhythm. Smiling, she steps into the warm sun. The metropolis stretches out endlessly before her, packed with wild possibilities and lethal danger. Celine walks straight into it, her chin held high. She is still terrified, yes, but she finally understands the ultimate truth. Courage is never the absence of fear. Courage is feeling your hands shake and marching forward anyway to defend the sanctuary you bled for. Now, you and I are going to jump ahead 5 long years into their reign. Celine is standing before a heavy mirror, adjusting the collar of a sharp midnight dark blazer. The bedroom around her screams of a powerful, shared life, framed memories, scattered books, an unbreakable partnership. Luca S.'s massive frame fills the doorway as he checks on his queen. His deep voice echoes in the quiet room, murmuring that she looks beautiful. Without missing a single beat, she smirks at him and replies that she just looks tired. Luke just smirks, his dark eyes gleaming, and insists that to him it is the exact same thing. Tonight is a battlefield of a different kind, a massive black tie gala for their foundation. The ballroom is dripping with wealth, crawling with high society donors, corrupt politicians, and sharks desperate to buy a halo. Celine absolutely despises these hollow networking rituals, but she plays the twisted game perfectly, knowing their dirty money funds her sanctuary programs. Stepping up to the microphone, she delivers a chillingly powerful speech about surviving the impossible. She never trauma dumps or whispers the names of her old ghosts. The heavy aura of a woman who walked through hell is more than enough. Afterward, billionaires are practically falling over themselves to hand her massive checks. She flashes a polished smile, playing the hyper-competent executive to absolute perfection. She owns this game now. Hours later, as the suffocating crowd finally thins, Luca tracks her down on the shadowed VIP balcony. He wraps his warmth around her, praising the power of her words. Celine waves it off, softly arguing she barely spoke 12 sentences. "You said them perfectly," he murmurs. Leaning against the iron railing, she looks over the city and asks if he ever thinks about their chaotic beginnings. The Don's armor completely drops. He admits those dark days never leave his mind. With raw vulnerability, he confesses his deep regret for the suffering he caused, the massive lies he spun, and the permanent target he painted on her back. But his voice turns fiercely possessive when he swears he will never apologize for fighting for her or for falling in love. Celine tangles her fingers with his, whispering that they are a total disaster, a beautiful mess. Luca counters softly, a chaos that belongs entirely to them. Standing there, breathing the cold night air, Celine finally processes the massive scale of what she survived. This right here, this dangerous, beautiful empire, is her final chapter. It is certainly not the soft, perfect fairy tale where a spotless knight rides in to rescue the helpless maiden. No, the life she built is incredibly complicated, laced with lethal threats, and cemented on a brutal foundation of agony and impossible survival choices. But the most intoxicating part, every single piece of it is hers. She chose to walk this jagged path, fighting tooth and nail to earn her throne. As she stands shoulder to shoulder with Luca, she realizes the ultimate truth we all must face. True freedom is never about desperately trying to outrun the dark. It is about learning exactly how to walk straight through the terrifying shadows without ever letting them consume your soul. You and I are going to look at this together tonight and ask, was the chaos worth it? Honestly, yes, because Celine did the most terrifying thing a person can do. She chose herself. She took the smoking wreckage of a mob war and built an empire from the ashes, refusing to apologize for making it out alive. As the night grows heavy and neon lights bleed through the rain, Celine just stands there smiling. For the first time, the running is over. No hitmen, no ghosts, no regrets. She is right at the top of the city, standing shoulder to shoulder with the biggest boss of them all. And maybe that is the real lesson here. Sometimes the only way to escape the darkness is to stop running, turn around, and own the night. Celine's phone call to Luca after Grant attacks her is one of the most powerful turning points in the story. For years, she has tried to survive alone. She works, hides the bruises, manages Grant's moods, and convinces herself that she can handle it. But after Grant puts his hand around her throat, something inside her finally understands that silence is no longer safety. Calling Luca is frightening because she does not fully trust him. He is dangerous, powerful, and connected to a world she does not understand. Yet in that moment, she chooses help over isolation. This teaches an important educational lesson. Asking for help is not failure. Many victims of abuse remain trapped because they feel ashamed, guilty, or afraid of being judged. They may believe they should have left earlier, or that no one will believe them. Celine shows that it is never too late to reach out. Her decision to call does not solve everything instantly, but it breaks the private prison Grant created around her. Luca's response also matters. He sends someone immediately, gives her a safe place, and arranges medical documentation of her injuries. This shows viewers the importance of practical support, safety, evidence, medical care, legal help, and a plan. However, the lesson is not that everyone needs a powerful rescuer. The deeper lesson is that abuse becomes harder to hide when someone outside the relationship is allowed to see the truth. A trusted friend, shelter, counselor, lawyer, doctor, or authority figure can become the first bridge out. Celine's courage is not in fighting Grant physically. Her courage is in saying, "I need help," after years of pretending she did not. That sentence can save a life.